December 1944. The war in Europe seems to be nearing its end. Allied armies have pushed across France after the liberation of Paris, and many commanders believe Nazi Germany is already collapsing under the pressure of two massive fronts. Soldiers talk about being home by Christmas. The German army appears exhausted, retreating, and outnumbered, but deep inside the frozen forests of the Ardennes, something unexpected is about to happen. In the early hours of December 16th, the silence of the winter morning is shattered. Thousands of German artillery guns suddenly open fire across a wide section of the front. Shells rain down on American positions, communication lines are cut, and confusion spreads through the ranks. Under the cover of snow, fog, and darkness, German armored divisions surge forward. Tanks, infantry, and mechanized units begin pushing through the forests, smashing into thinly defended American lines. It is the beginning of a massive surprise offensive ordered by Adolf Hitler himself. A desperate gamble that will become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's plan is bold and dangerous. He hopes to drive a powerful wedge through the Allied lines in the Ardennes, split the British and American armies apart, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. If successful, the entire Allied offensive in Western Europe could collapse, forcing the Allies into negotiations and possibly changing the course of the war. For the German army, it is a final attempt to seize the initiative before their resources completely run out. As German forces push westward, they carve a massive bulge into the Allied front lines. Entire American units are caught off guard. Some are overrun, others retreat in confusion through the icy forests. Roads are clogged with vehicles, soldiers, and refugees trying to escape the sudden advance. The front becomes chaotic, fragmented, and unpredictable. In the middle of this chaos lies a small Belgian town that suddenly becomes critically important. That town is Bastogne. Bastogne may look insignificant on a map, but it sits at the center of a crucial road network. 7 major roads pass through the town, making it a key transportation hub for any army operating in the region. Whoever controls Bastogne controls the movement of troops, tanks, and supplies across the battlefield. German commanders know this, and they move quickly to surround it. Inside the town, thousands of American soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division and other units find themselves cut off. German forces close in from all sides, forming a tight ring around the defenders. Supplies begin to run low. Ammunition is rationed carefully. Medical equipment is scarce, and the wounded fill makeshift aid stations. The weather grows worse with every passing day. Heavy snow covers the ground, temperatures drop below freezing, and thick clouds prevent Allied aircraft from providing support. The defenders of Bastogne are isolated, cold, and under constant pressure. German tanks and infantry attack repeatedly, trying to break through the American lines. Artillery shells pound the town day and night. The Germans even demand the surrender of the surrounded forces, believing resistance is pointless. Yet the Americans refuse. They hold their positions, digging into frozen ground and preparing to fight for every street and every building. While the situation in Bastogne grows more desperate, far to the south another story is unfolding. One of the most aggressive and controversial commanders in the Allied army is already studying the unfolding crisis. General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, is known for his speed, his bold tactics, and his relentless drive to keep moving forward. Unlike many commanders who are still trying to understand the scale of the German attack, Patton immediately begins thinking about how to strike back. When Allied leaders gather to discuss the German offensive, most believe it will take weeks to reorganize their forces and respond effectively. But Patton proposes something astonishing. He claims he can turn his entire army north and launch a counterattack toward Bastogne in just a few days. Moving an army is never simple. It means redirecting tens of thousands of soldiers, thousands of vehicles, artillery units, supply convoys, and armored divisions across winter roads in the middle of a major enemy offensive. Yet Patton insists it can be done. Within hours, orders begin moving through the Third Army. Units that had been advancing east toward Germany suddenly receive new instructions. Columns of tanks, trucks, and artillery begin turning north. Roads fill with military traffic as entire divisions change direction. Engineers struggle to keep routes open while snow and ice make movement slow and dangerous. Every hour matters, because the soldiers trapped in Bastogne cannot hold out forever. The race is on. Patton's forces must travel across dozens of miles of frozen terrain, through narrow forest roads and crowded supply routes. At the same time, German armored units are still advancing and attempting to tighten their grip around Bastogne. If Patton's army moves too slowly, the defenders may be crushed before help arrives. If the Germans manage to block the roads, the relief force could be delayed long enough for the situation to collapse completely. For the soldiers inside Bastogne, every day feels like an eternity. The cold bites through their uniforms, food is limited, and the constant artillery bombardment keeps them on edge. Yet they continue to fight, holding their lines against repeated German attacks. They know that somewhere beyond the snow-covered forests, reinforcements may be coming. The question is whether those reinforcements will arrive in time. What follows is one of the most dramatic maneuvers of the Second World War. A high-speed winter campaign that pushes men, machines, and commanders to their limits. It is a story of desperation, determination, and one of the boldest military decisions ever made on the Western Front. This is the story of Patton's race to Bastogne, the frozen gamble that helped decide the fate of the Battle of the Bulge. There are moments in history when everything hangs by a thread, when weather, timing, terrain, supply, and chance all collide in a fragile balance. During the winter of 1944, that thread stretched across the frozen Ardennes forest. The German army had launched its last desperate gamble, the Ardennes offensive, smashing through thin American lines and surrounding the crossroads town of Bastogne. Inside that icy pocket were the soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division, cut off, exhausted, under constant artillery bombardment and freezing in foxholes scraped into frozen earth. German commanders believed they had trapped them for good. They expected surrender. They expected silence. What they got instead was George Patton. Patton did not accept the impossible. He crushed it beneath his boots. He was loud, vulgar, brilliant, infuriating, a paradox wrapped in polished leather boots and a helmet that caught the winter sun like a knife. Other generals saw weather reports, supply shortages, frozen roads, fuel rations. Patton saw an opportunity to do something history would never forget. While the German offensive surged into the forest, Patton sat at a planning table with a map spread before him, listening to intelligence reports of the disaster unfolding. He was told the Airborne Division was trapped, completely surrounded, that relief was impossible, that winter made movement suicidal. Patton leaned over the table, pointed at Bastogne, and said 5 words that cut through doubt like a blade. "We're going to save them." His staff stared in disbelief. To move an entire army, tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, artillery, fuel trucks, medics through snow-choked roads in less than 3 days was something military textbooks defined as fantasy. Roads were iced over, fuel lines were thin, and many units were still facing German attacks. Patton didn't care. He demanded that every plan be rewritten. In one meeting with Eisenhower, Patton was asked how quickly he could pivot his forces north. Patton answered immediately, "My army is already moving." And it was. Patton had anticipated disaster before the meeting was even called. He had prepared 3 separate operational plans ready to execute at a moment's notice. While other commanders reacted, Patton acted. He demanded his men move through the night, through snowstorms, through exhaustion so severe that drivers taped their eyelids open. Soldiers marched beside tanks because there was no room to ride. Fuel convoys followed precarious mountain roads, lit only by moonlight and tracer fire. The march became a race not against the Germans but against time. At Bastogne, conditions worsened. Men wrapped burlap on their boots. Medics rationed morphine and prayed. Artillery shells fell day and night, hammering frozen ground. Some men had no winter coats. Many had no ammunition. Yet they held. When a German surrender demand arrived, the American reply was just one word: nuts. That defiance echoed through every snowdrift, every shattered building, every foxhole. But defiance alone could not break the encirclement. Patton could. He pushed his army through snow so deep that tracks vanished behind them. Frostbite tore at hands and faces. Engines stalled from ice. Soldiers slept standing up. But the march continued. The world shrank into cold suffering and endurance. Patton drove his men not through orders alone, but through belief. Belief that if they moved fast enough, if they refused to stop, if they pushed beyond the limits of exhaustion, they could reach the 100 Airborne before the Germans crushed them. On December 26, after days of non-stop movement, an American tank from the 4th Armored Division broke through the German perimeter and rolled into Bastogne. Soldiers cheered, shouting through cracked lips and frozen throats. Men climbed onto tanks with tears in their eyes. They were saved not by luck, not by weather, not by chance, but by speed. Patton had done the impossible. Relief of Bastogne became more than a maneuver. It became a symbol, a reminder that sometimes victory comes down to momentum, and leadership is the willingness to drown out inaction. Patton once wrote, "A good plan violently executed today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow." Base proved him right. In that frozen hell where hope was measured in hours and lives in inches of snow, speed became salvation. Tonight we return to the snow-covered Ardennes, to the trucks sliding across ice, to the tanks roaring forward with empty fuel cans, to the men marching behind them because there was no room to ride, to the moment when one generals will outrun winter itself. This is the entire history of Patton's race through the Ardennes, the desperate march, the impossible timing, and the rescue that became legendary. Before we begin, I want to picture you in this moment. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are listening from? Are you in bed under warm blankets, drifting towards sleep? Or maybe sitting at a desk somewhere quiet, letting history take you someplace far from your day? Tell me. I always love knowing the time and place where these stories end up living. And if these long, slow journeys into history help you unwind, escape, or fall asleep a little easier, consider subscribing. It lets me know you want more deep storytelling that doesn't rush, stories that take their time, the way history deserves to be told. December 10, 1944. Private First Class John Shaner of the 106th Infantry Division stepped off a transport truck into the Belgian Ardennes and felt something he hadn't experienced since basic training: relief. Around him, soldiers from the Golden Lions Division shouldered their packs with the casualties of men who just won a lottery they didn't know they'd entered. This was the Ghost Front, 80 meters of dense forest and snow-covered hills where for months nothing had happened. Veterans from other units were rotating out, heading to rest areas with knowing smiles, offering advice that all sounded the same: enjoy the quiet, stay warm, don't get careless. The new rivals, most of them fresh from training camps in America, had heard the rumors that this was where divisions came to recover, where the war had forgotten to show up. Snorts, they were wrong. The 106th Division was so new to combat that some soldiers still had Cosmoline grease on their rifle bolts. They'd arrived in Europe just weeks earlier, been rushed through minimal acclimatization, and now found themselves responsible for a frontage that military doctrine said should be held by at least 3 divisions. 80 miles of forest, river valleys, and medieval villages stretched before them, defended by just 83,000 American troops facing an enemy they believed to be exhausted, depleted, beaten. Intelligence reports suggested minimal German activity, a few elderly Vox grenadiers holding defensive positions, perhaps some garrison troops waiting out the war's inevitable conclusion. The woods were silent except for wind through bare trees and the occasional crack of ice on the Our River. But silence, as Shaner and thousands like him would learn, could be the most dangerous sound of all. What these soldiers didn't know, what their commanders didn't know, was that across the Our River, in the hills and forests of Germany, 200,000 German troops were holding their breath, hidden beneath camouflage nets and evergreen branches, 410,000 men of 3 entire armies had assembled in absolute radio silence. Hitler himself had planned this operation Walk's Armouring Watch on the Rhine, a name deliberately chosen to sound defensive while concealing the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. The plan was audacious to the point of fantasy. Punch through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. The fuel would come from captured American depots. The success would come from surprise, weather, and the assumption that the Americans would never see it coming. They didn't. On December 15th, the evening before the attack, American soldiers along the Ghost Front settled into routines that had become comfortable. Some wrote letters home describing the peaceful sector. Others played cards in farmhouse cellars or heated rations over wood stoves, salvaged from abandoned buildings. A few ventured close enough to the German lines to hear something strange. Music drifting across the valley. Christmas carols sung in German. The sound carrying through cold air with crystalline clarity. One forward observer reported hearing engines, lots of them. But his report joined dozens of others in intelligence files, marked routine patrol activity. In a command post in the village of St. The 5th officer studied maps showing a quiet sector and planned for a quiet December. Outside, the temperature dropped below freezing. The moon rose full and bright, then disappeared behind clouds rolling in from the west. December 16th, 5:30 in the morning. Darkness still held the Ardennes in frozen grip when the world exploded. 1,900 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, the largest artillery barrage on the Western Front since 1918. Shells screamed through darkness and detonated in American positions that had been meticulously plotted by German observers for weeks. In command posts, telephone lines went dead in foxholes. Men died before they fully awoke. And then came the searchlights. Massive anti-aircraft lights pointed not at the sky, but at low-hanging clouds, their beams bouncing off the overcast to create artificial moonlight that turned night into eerie shadowless twilight. Through this ghostly illumination, German infantry began to move. By 7 in the morning, the carefully ordered world of American military operations in the Ardennes had collapsed into chaos. Radio operators transmitted fragmentary contradictory reports. Large-scale attack. Exact location unknown. Communications disrupted. Casualties mounting. The 106th Division, which had held the center of the American line for exactly 5 days, found itself hit by 2 entire German corps. Villages that had been quiet crossroads became desperate strongpoints. Soldiers who'd never fired their weapons in combat now fought at ranges so close they could see their enemies' faces. Companies lost contact with battalions. Battalions lost contact with regiments. By afternoon, 2 entire regiments of the 106th, more than 8,000 men were surrounded in the Schnee Eifel, a forested ridgeline they'd been told to hold at all costs. They would hold it for 3 days before surrendering in what would become the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. But the full scope of the disaster remained hidden in fog, confusion, and disrupted communications. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, the first report suggested nothing more than a local counterattack, perhaps a spoiling attack designed to disrupt Allied offensives. General Dwight Eisenhower, reading morning intelligence summaries, noted the activity, but saw no reason for alarm. The Ardennes was a secondary front thinly held by design, a calculated risk that allowed concentration of forces for offensives north and south. Even as German panzers began grinding through shattered American positions, even as thousands of soldiers retreated in disorder or were captured, the Allied High Command remained convinced this was containable, local, temporary. They were wrong about that, too. The weather, which had been merely cold, now became an active enemy. Thick fog settled into valleys and refused to lift. Freezing rain turned roads into skating rinks. Snow began to fall, first lightly, then heavily, accumulating in drifts that swallowed jeeps and obscured landmarks, and most critically, the overcast ceiling dropped to near zero, grounding the Allied air forces that had dominated European skies for months. For the first time since Normandy, German forces could move in daylight without fear of fighter bombers. The Luftwaffe, husbanding its last reserves of fuel and aircraft, flew missions over the breakthrough zones. It was as if the Germans had ordered the weather from a military catalogue, and it had arrived exactly on schedule. American soldiers, many still wearing the light field jackets they'd been issued for autumn operations, began to learn what cold truly meant. By nightfall on December 16th, the situation had crystallized into something unprecedented in the American experience of the European War. 3 German armies, the 6th Panzer Army in the north, the 5th Panzer Army in the center, the 7th Army in the south, had achieved complete tactical surprise and were advancing on multiple axes. Villages marked on American maps as secured were now behind German lines. Headquarters that had been planning Christmas parties were packing files and retreating. Thousands of soldiers cut off from their units wandered through forests, trying to find friendly lines that had moved miles to the rear. In Washington, the War Department began drafting press releases that would describe the situation in vague terms and emphasize that counterattacks were being prepared. In London, Winston Churchill received reports and recognized immediately what American commanders had not yet fully grasped. This was not a raid or a spoiling attack, but a genuine offensive, a last desperate gamble by an enemy everyone had thought was finished. The Ghost Front had earned its name in the most terrible way possible. For months, it had been the place where nothing happened and that nothing had been a trap. The Germans had watched, planned, assembled, and waited for weather that would blind Allied air power and ground, that would freeze hard enough to support tanks. They had gambled everything on surprise, on weather, on the assumption that thinly held American positions would shatter under concentrated attack. For 3 days, they would be right. Thousands of American soldiers would die, be captured, or retreat in disorder. Entire units would cease to exist as organized fighting forces, and yet in that chaos, in foxholes and farmhouse cellars and improvised roadblocks, other soldiers would begin to slow the German advance, trading time for space, lives for hours, creating the conditions that would allow reinforcements to arrive. One of those reinforcements racing north from positions over 100 miles away would be commanded by a general named George Patton, but on December 16th, as soldiers of the 106th Division fought their first and last battle, as the Ghost Front became a killing ground, as the largest German offensive in the West began its terrible work, Patton was somewhere else entirely, planning an attack in a completely different direction, unaware that his war was about to change. December 12, 1944, 4 days before the German offensive began, in a requisition building in Nancy, France, General George Smith Patton Jr. stood before a map of the Saar region and explained to his staff exactly where the Germans would attack next, not in the Saar, where his Third Army was currently grinding through fortified positions, not against the British in the north, in the Ardennes, through the mountains, just like they did in 1914 and again in 1940. His staff officers exchanged glances that Patton pretended not to see. The Ardennes was First Army territory, not Third Army's concern, and besides, intelligence said the Germans were finished, depleted, incapable of major offensive operations. Patton tapped the map with a pointer and spoke the words that would later seem prophetic, but which in that moment sounded like the paranoid fantasy of a general who saw enemies everywhere. They'll come through here, and when they do, we'll be ready to hit them in the flank. This was Patton at 60 years old, a man of contradictions, so profound they bordered on caricature. He wore custom uniforms and ivory-handled revolvers. He wrote poetry and wept at the sight of American war cemeteries. He believed in reincarnation and thought he'd fought in every major war in history. He could quote ancient military texts in original Latin and curse so creatively that even hardened sergeants took notes. His soldiers loved him and feared him in equal measure, often simultaneously. His superiors considered him a necessary evil, brilliant but unstable, capable of winning battles, but equally capable of public relations disasters that had nearly ended his career twice. The first time in Sicily, he'd slapped shell-shocked soldiers and called them cowards, triggering a scandal that had almost sent him home in disgrace. He'd survived through a combination of Eisenhower's protection and his own irreplaceable skill at mobile warfare. Now, in December 1944, he commanded the Third Army, a force of more than 250 men spread across a 100-mile front in eastern France, driving toward the Saar and the Rhine beyond. But Patton's attention, even as his army fought daily battles, kept returning to the Ardennes. It wasn't intuition or mysticism, though he claimed both later. It was professional military judgment based on terrain, history, and understanding of German operational art. The Ardennes represented the weakest point in the Allied line. Mountainous, heavily forested, thinly defended, intersected by roads that led directly to Antwerp and the vital port facilities that supplied the entire Allied advance. If the Germans had fuel for one more offensive, and Patton believed they'd been hoarding reserves precisely for that purpose, they'd attack through the Ardennes because it offered the only route, with strategic objectives worth the cost. On December 12, he ordered his operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, to prepare contingency plans for disengaging Third Army from its current offensive and pivoting north. Maddox, accustomed to Patton's unconventional thinking, complied. The plans were filed in folders marked nickel, dime, and quarter corresponding to turning 3, 4, or 6 divisions 90 to attack northward into the southern flank of any German penetration. December 16 arrived with Patton in his headquarters, preparing to observe an attack by the 4th Armored Division toward the Saar. At mid-morning, the first reports arrived. Heavy German artillery fire in the mine. Ardennes communications disrupted. Situation unclear. Patton's response, recorded by multiple witnesses, was immediate and characteristic. "Fine. Let them come. We should be able to stop them." While other commanders scrambled to understand what was happening, Patton walked to his map room and studied the Ardennes terrain with the focus of a chess master, recognizing a gambit he'd anticipated. By afternoon, as fragmentary reports suggested something larger than a local counterattack, he summoned Maddox and gave the order that would define the next 2 weeks. Prepare to move north, not to defend, to attack, to hit the German southern flank while they were extended, overcommitted, vulnerable. Eisenhower hadn't asked for this. First Army hadn't requested support. Patton was making strategic decisions based on his reading of the tactical situation, and for a subordinate commander that bordered on insubordination, he didn't care. The challenge Patton proposed was staggering even by the standards of modern mechanized warfare. Third Army was engaged in offensive operations along its entire front, with units in contact with German forces. Supply lines stretched to support those operations. Artillery positions registered 4 fire missions in the Saar, not the Ardennes. To disengage while in contact with the enemy, turn 90, moved more than 100 miles north through winter weather on inadequate roads, and attack into the flank of a German offensive that might or might not still be developing. This was the kind of maneuver that military theorists wrote about in academic journals, not something armies actually executed. It required perfect staff work, extraordinary discipline, flexible logistics, and command authority that extended from army headquarters down to individual squad leaders. It required soldiers who understood commander intent and could execute without detailed orders. It required, in short, exactly the kind of army Patton had spent 6 months creating, because here was the secret that history sometimes glosses over. In its emphasis on Patton's theatrical personality, he was a superb trainer and organizer. Third Army functioned like a machine precisely because Patton had built it to function that way, had installed staff officers who understood his methods, had pushed commanders at every level to practice rapid decision-making and flexible response. He drilled his divisions on movement techniques, on traffic control, on exactly the kind of complex redeployment he was now contemplating. The contingency plans Maddox pulled from those folders weren't theoretical exercises, but detailed operation orders with unit assignments, movement tables, traffic control measures, and supply arrangements already calculated. Patton had prepared for this moment not because he was psychic, but because he was professional, because he understood that war was about creating options, and being ready to exercise them faster than the enemy could respond. December 17th brought confirmation that the German attack was no raid, but a major offensive, potentially the largest since the Battle of France in 1940. Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters began to grasp the strategic implications. If the Germans reached the Meuse River, if they drove toward Antwerp, they could split the Allied armies and create a crisis that might delay the end of the war by months. He summoned his senior commanders to a meeting at Verdun, the same French city where American forces had fought in World War I. For December 19th, Patton received the summons and immediately understood what it meant. Eisenhower would ask what Third Army could do to help. Patton intended to have an answer that would make every other option irrelevant. He told Maddox to refine the contingency plans to assume Third Army would be ordered north to begin preliminary movements that could be explained as defensive repositioning, but which would give Third Army a head start on the actual relief operation. On the evening of December 17th, Patton sat alone in his office and did something his public persona would never have admitted. He worried not about whether his plan could work. He believed absolutely in his army's capability, but about what it would cost. Moving an army while in contact with the enemy was dangerous. Soldiers would die in traffic accidents on icy roads. Units would be hit during movement by German attacks. The initial assault would be made by divisions that arrived exhausted with disrupted supply lines, attacking an enemy whose exact positions and strength remained unclear. Men he knew by name, commanders he trained personally, would be dead within a week. That knowledge sat in his stomach like lead. But Patton had long ago made peace with the arithmetic of command. Soldiers died in war, and the only question was whether their deaths achieved objectives worth the cost. Relieving pressure on First Army, preventing a breakthrough to the Meuse, destroying German forces in a salient where they'd be vulnerable to counterattack. Those were objectives worth paying for. December 18th brought more clarity and worse news. The German penetration was deepening. First Army units were retreating in some sectors, surrounded in others. The town of Bastogne, a nothing place that happened to sit at the junction of 7 roads, had become suddenly critical because those roads represented the only good routes through the Ardennes. If the Germans took Bastogne, they could move supplies and reinforcements through the entire region. If the Americans held it, German units would be forced onto secondary roads that couldn't support heavy traffic. Eisenhower had already ordered the 101st Airborne Division to Bastogne, but paratroopers didn't have the tanks and artillery to hold against armored assault indefinitely. They'd need relief, and soon. Patton looked at the map and calculated distances, march rates, resistance factors. Third Army could reach Bastogne, but not in time to prevent encirclement. They'd have to break through German lines to get there. Another layer of complexity, another multiplication of risk. On that night Patton did something he rarely did. He attended religious services. The Third Army chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, led a simple ceremony in a cold chapel. Patton prayed, though what he prayed for remained private. What's documented is what he said afterward, that they would need fair weather, that air support would make the difference between success and catastrophe, and that perhaps the chaplain should draft a prayer for the entire army. O'Neill, accustomed to Patton's unconventional requests, agreed. Neither man mentioned that the weather forecast showed continued overcast for at least a week. Neither mentioned that even if Third Army executed perfectly, even if every unit moved on schedule and attacked with maximum effectiveness, thousands of soldiers were about to die in a winter campaign through mountainous terrain, against a desperate enemy. These things didn't need saying. Patton returned to his headquarters and worked through the night, refining plans, writing orders, calculating the impossible, and making it merely improbable. In 50 hours, he would stand before Eisenhower and the entire Allied High Command and make a promise that military professionals would consider absurd. He would promise to attack in 72 hours with 3 divisions, to move 90 while in enemy contact, to advance 100 miles through winter weather, to break through German lines and relieve Bastogne. And he would mean every word. December 17, 1944, 9 o'clock in the evening in a movie theater in Reims, France. Paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division were watching a film whose title nobody would remember, because nobody saw the ending. The lights came up mid-scene. A major walked onto the stage. His voice carried the kind of forced calm that told experienced soldiers something had gone very wrong. All passes cancelled. Full combat gear. TOUCKS departing in 1 hour. Destination classified. The paratroopers filed out in disciplined silence. The kind of silence that comes from men who've done this before, who recognize the signs of emergency deployment, who know that classified destination means somewhere bad. They jumped into Normandy on D-Day. They jumped into Holland for Operation Market Garden. They hadn't expected to be trucked into Belgium in December wearing summer uniforms, because somebody somewhere had decided they didn't have time to issue winter gear. 380 trucks rolled through the darkness carrying 11,000 paratroopers north toward a town most of them couldn't pronounce and none had heard of before that night. Bastogne, a market town in the Belgian, population around 4,000, distinguished primarily by being utterly undistinguished, except for one feature that now made it the most important real estate in Europe. 7 roads converged there, in the complicated terrain of the Ardennes, with its steep valleys and forested ridges. Those roads represented the only practical routes for moving supplies, reinforcements, and armor. The Germans needed those roads to support their offensive. The Americans needed to deny them. Everything else, the strategic objectives, the plans for reaching the Meuse, the dreams of splitting the Allied armies, depended on controlling a small Belgian town, where old women sold vegetables in a market square and children played in streets that by tomorrow would become a battlefield. The truck convoy moved through freezing darkness with only blackout lights, following roads clogged with other traffic, all of it heading in the wrong direction. Ambulances bringing wounded to the rear, supply trucks retreating from depots about to be overrun, headquarters units evacuating in disorder. The paratroopers watched this traffic and understood. They weren't reinforcing a stable position, but plugging a hole in a broken dam. Some trucks broke down, others slid off icy roads. The convoy stretched over miles, lost cohesion, became less a military movement than a desperate race against time that nobody was quite sure they could win. Officers with maps tried to determine where the front lines actually were, discovered that nobody knew that the situation was so fluid that map coordinates given an hour ago were already obsolete. They kept driving north, following compass bearings and hope. December 18th evening, lead elements of the 101st entered Bastogne and found a town in chaos. Belgian civilians packed belongings onto carts, fleeing west. American stragglers wandered streets, men separated from units, tanks without fuel, artillery crews without guns. A few intact units held positions east of town, but they were falling back and the Germans weren't far behind. The acting commander of the 101st, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, set up headquarters in a Belgian army barracks and made rapid assessments. The situation was worse than briefings had suggested. The encirclement was closer than anyone expected, but the roads were still open, barely, and reinforcements were arriving. Besides the paratroopers, elements of the 10th Armored Division had reached Bastogne. 3 tank infantry teams, designated Cherry, O'Hara, and de Sabry, each built around a company of Sherman tanks under a company of armored infantry. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. And McAuliffe had learned in Normandy and Holland that paratroopers with determination could hold positions that armored divisions couldn't take. The perimeter took shape through the night of December 18th and into December 19th. Not a carefully planned defensive line, but an improvised arc of positions dictated by terrain, available forces, and best guesses about where Germans would attack. Infantry dug foxholes in frozen ground. Tank crews positioned Sherman's hold down behind ridges. Artillery battalions, the 101st Zone plus attached units, 18 battalions in total registered coordinates, and established fire support plans. Engineers prepared demolitions on bridges and road junctions. It was textbook defensive preparation, executed at emergency speed by soldiers who'd done this before and knew that details saved lives. Ammunition was distributed. Aid stations were established. Communication wire was strung. Officers walked the perimeter, checking positions, making adjustments, telling soldiers the relief would come soon, even though nobody knew if that was true. December 20th, dawn. The last road into Bastogne closed. German units moving faster than American intelligence had projected completed the encirclement during the night. McAuliffe received the news with the calm of a man who'd expected it and planned for it. The 101st had jumped behind German lines in Normandy and fought surrounded 4 days before link-up. This was familiar territory psychologically, if not geographically. The real questions were tactical. How much ammunition did they have? Enough for 3 days, maybe 4 if they rationed. Food adequate? Barely. Medical supplies sufficient for now, but wounded couldn't be evacuated and would accumulate. Fuel for tanks and vehicles. Critical shortage developing. Winter gear. Soldiers were wearing field jackets in temperatures that dropped below 0 Fahrenheit at night. Morale. As long as soldiers believed relief was coming, morale would hold. The moment they stopped believing, the defense would begin to crack from the inside. The German command, meanwhile, looked at Bastogne and saw an obstacle that shouldn't have existed. Their timetable called for crossing the Meuse by December 22nd. Bastogne was supposed to fall in the first 48 hours, its roads becoming German supply routes, its defenders becoming prisoners. Instead, American forces had somehow assembled there in impossible time and were showing no signs of surrender. The German commander, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, made his decision. Bastogne was blocking to entire panzer divisions. It had to be reduced immediately. He assigned the 26th Volksgrenadier Division to assault the town, while his panzers bypassed it to the north and south. On paper, it made sense. The Volksgrenadiers outnumbered the defenders. They had artillery support. The Americans were surrounded, cut off, weakening daily. It should have worked. December 21st brought the first major German assaults. Infantry attacks supported by artillery hit positions around the perimeter, probing for weak points, testing defenses, paying the initial costs of what would become a siege. American defenders fired with discipline learned through combat experience. Bazooka teams knocked out German tanks at short range. Artillery observers called fire missions that brought shells down with devastating accuracy. This was the American advantage. The thing German commanders hadn't fully accounted for. The fact that American artillery doctrine emphasized mass fires directed by skilled observers, who could concentrate 18 battalions on a single target. German attacks developed, pressed forward, ran into walls of explosive that stopped them cold. By evening, the perimeter held everywhere, and the frozen ground around Bastogne was littered with German dead. Inside the perimeter, conditions worsened. Ammunition expenditure exceeded conservative estimates. Food supplies dwindled faster than planned because the garrison was larger than initial counts. Suggested stragglers and remnants of other units had swelled the numbers to over 15,000 men. Wounded accumulated in aid stations lying on stone floors in Belgian cellars. Because there weren't enough blankets or CS, medical officers performed surgery by lamplight, rationing morphine, making triage decisions that would haunt them for decades. And the cold soldiers in foxholes stamped feet to maintain circulation, rubbed hands together, shared body heat in two-man holes, trench foot and frostbite cases mounted, reducing effective strength without a single shot being fired. Officers calculated at current attrition rates, even without further combat, the garrison would become ineffective in approximately 1 week. Relief had to come before then. December 21st afternoon, a German delegation approached American lines under white flag. They carried an ultimatum typed on formal Wehrmacht stationery, addressed to the American commander of Bastogne, demanding surrender within 2 hours. To avoid total annihilation, the message made its way to McCaw's headquarters. He read it, tossed it aside, and said a single word that captured his assessment of German. "Chances nuts." His staff officers, translating this into formal military correspondence, wrote a reply that would become legendary for its brevity and defiance. To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. The German officers receiving this response required explanation of the term. The American officer who delivered it helpfully clarified, "It means go to hell." The Germans withdrew. The war would continue, and somewhere to the south, still days away, still fighting through German positions, George Patton's Third Army was coming. The paratroopers in Bastogne didn't know exactly when. They didn't know if they'd survive until relief arrived. But they knew someone was coming, and that made all the difference between defending and merely dying. December 19, 1944, 11 o'clock in the morning. The Eagles Barracks in Verdun, France, a cold, damp stone building that smelled of disinfectant and old walls filled with men, whose decisions would determine whether thousands of soldiers lived or died, whether the war in Europe would end in months or drag into another year, whether Germany's last gamble would succeed or fail catastrophically. General Dwight Eisenhower arrived looking tired. And why wouldn't he? 3 days ago, he had commanded armies winning the war. Now, those armies were reeling from the largest German offensive in the West since 1940, and Eisenhower's decisions in the next hours would matter more than anything he'd done since ordering the Normandy invasion. He looked around the room at faces he knew well. Omar Bradley, whose 12th Army Group had responsibility for the sector the Germans had just torn open. Jacob Dees, commanding the 6th Army Group to the south. British officers representing Montgomery, who commanded 21st Army Group in the north. Staff officers with maps and casualty reports and intelligence summaries that grew worse with each update. And George Patton, who'd driven through ice and snow to arrive precisely on time, wearing a uniform so immaculate it looked like he'd dressed for a parade, rather than an emergency conference. Patton had brought his operations officer and his maps, and he'd brought something else. Absolute confidence that he knew what needed to happen next and the Third Army could execute it. The other officers in the room viewed Patton with attitudes ranging from grudging respect to outright hostility. He'd saved operations with brilliant mobile warfare, but he'd also caused public relations disasters and made enemies with his ego and his mouth. Bradley, his immediate superior, had complicated feelings about Patton that combined professional admiration with personal exasperation. British officers considered him a cowboy, unpredictable, and unreliable. Patton didn't care what anyone thought. He'd studied the map. He'd calculated the mathematics of time, distance, and force. He knew what had to happen, and he was prepared to promise it. Eisenhower opened the meeting with words calculated to set tone and frame the discussion. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. It was standard Eisenhower, the kind of leadership statement designed to prevent panic and focus minds on solutions, rather than problems. But everyone in that room knew the reality behind the optimism. German forces had penetrated 50 miles into Allied lines. 2 American divisions had been effectively destroyed. Thousands of soldiers were dead, wounded, captured, or missing. The town of Bastogne was surrounded. German panzers were still advancing, and nobody was entirely certain where the front lines actually were from 1 hour to the next. This was by any objective measure the worst crisis the Western Allies had faced since Normandy. Eisenhower's characterization of it as opportunity was technically accurate. A German offensive meant German forces extended are vulnerable to counterattack, but it required a particular kind of strategic optimism to frame disaster as advantage. The discussion turned to reinforcements, to shifting units from quiet sectors, to what could be moved where and how quickly. Various proposals floated through the room, each with merits and complications. Pull units from the south, but that might invite German attacks there. Bring British reserves south, but that would take time. Montgomery would resent yielding. Extend defensive lines, contract perimeters, trade space for time. Eisenhower listened, synthesized, began to form the outline of a plan. And then Patton, who'd been silent, asked the question everyone knew was coming, but nobody expected. Phrased quite this way: when do you want me to attack? Not if, when. The presumption embedded in those 6 words was extraordinary. Patton wasn't offering to help or suggesting he might contribute. He was assuming Third Army's attack was already decided, and only the timing remained to be established. Eisenhower, who knew Patton well enough to recognize grandstanding when he heard it, asked the logical follow-up: when can you start? And Patton, without hesitation, without consulting notes, delivered the answer he'd prepared. December 22nd, with 3 divisions 72 hours from now. 3 full divisions, 45,000 men, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles turned 90 from their current operations, moved 100 miles north through winter weather on inadequate roads, assembled for coordinated attack, and launched into the southern flank of the German offensive. The room went silent. Staff officers performed mental calculations and concluded Patton was either joking or delusional. Bradley, who understood Third Army's capabilities better than anyone except Patton, thought it might barely be possible, but wouldn't bet on it. British officers exchanged looks that suggested they just witnessed confirmation of every negative stereotype about American commanders: more enthusiasm than competence, more bravado than brains. Eisenhower, who dealt with Patton's theatrical confidence for years, responded with words that combined skepticism and hope. Don't be fatuous, George. Don't make promises you can't keep. Don't let ego override judgment. Don't fail, because if you fail at this, if you promise and don't deliver, we'll lose more than Bastogne. We might lose the entire campaign. Patton didn't flinch. He explained with more detail than dramatic flair that Third Army had prepared contingency plans for exactly this kind of pivot, that preliminary movements had already begun under guise of defensive repositioning, that staff work was complete, that orders would be transmitted within hours, that the 3 divisions, 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, 80th Infantry, were already being alerted. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment promise. This was a professional military operation that had been prepared, war-gained, and made ready for execution the moment higher headquarters gave permission. The meeting continued for hours, working through details, alternatives, contingencies. Eisenhower made decisions that would reshape the entire Allied front. First Army would be temporarily placed under Montgomery's command to consolidate the northern defense. Debs would extend his lines to cover sectors Third Army was abandoning. Reinforcements would be rushed from England and rear areas. Air forces would fly maximum effort missions as soon as weather permitted. And Third Army would attack north, would attempt to relieve Bastogne, would hit the German southern flank with everything Patton could deliver. It was a plan born of crisis assembled under pressure, dependent on dozens of things going right simultaneously. If it failed, the consequences would cascade. The stone would fall. German momentum would continue. The war would extend into 1945 with outcomes nobody could predict. As the meeting broke up, Patton gathered with his operations officer to translate strategic decisions into executable orders. The contingency plans would be activated immediately. Codeword Nickel for 3 divisions. Movement tables already prepared would be transmitted. Units would receive orders through secure channels, many discovering they'd already started executing operations they didn't know they'd been assigned. Traffic control measures would activate. Supply dumps would reposition. Artillery units would displace. Engineers would prepare routes. Medical units would move forward. The entire Third Army staff system, honed through 6 months of combat operations, would shift from planning to execution, from theoretical to actual, from possible to inevitable. 133,000 soldiers would receive orders that would change their war. Most wouldn't understand the full scope until later. They'd simply do what soldiers do. Follow orders, move where directed, fight when necessary. Trust that someone somewhere understood the larger picture. Patton returned to his headquarters and worked through the night. He reviewed plans with staff officers, signed orders, checked details that less meticulous commanders would have delegated. He walked to the map room repeatedly, studying terrain, calculating approach routes, identifying obstacles. He made phone calls to division commanders speaking in his command voice. That allowed no doubt this would happen. They would execute. Third Army would demonstrate that American forces could do what German forces were attempting, and do it faster, more effectively with better results. Around midnight, he paused long enough to write in his diary, recording the day's events and his assessment. We can do it, but it will be one hell of a job. Then he returned to work. Outside, across eastern France and into Belgium, units were beginning to move. The race to Bastogne had begun, though Bastogne didn't yet know it, and the soldiers starting that race didn't know if they'd arrive in time, or find anything left to save when they got there. December 19, 1944, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Colonel Maddox, 3rd Army Operations Officer, sat in a headquarters building in Nancy with a telephone in one hand, and a set of sealed envelopes in the other. The phone call from Ardennes had just ended. Patton had delivered the authorization everyone knew was coming. Execute Nickel. 3 divisions. 72 hours. Full pivot north. Maddox hung up the phone and allowed himself 30 seconds to contemplate what had just been ordered. The kind of military maneuver that theoretical studies said was possible, but that no modern army had actually executed while in contact with an enemy. And then he began the process of turning theory into practice. The envelopes contained orders drafted days ago, updated continuously as intelligence changed, refined through wargaming sessions that staff officers had conducted, while the fighting raged in the Ardennes. Now, those orders would transform from staff exercises into movement tables, assembly areas, attack objectives, life and death decisions affecting 133,000 men. The 3rd Army staff system that Patton had built over 6 months of operations began to function with mechanical precision. Operations officers pulled files marked with division designations. Intelligence officers updated enemy situation maps. Logistics officers calculated fuel requirements, ammunition loads, ration allocations. Transportation officers reviewed road networks and established traffic priorities. Communication officers prepared message traffic. Engineers identified obstacles and prepared solutions. Medical officers positioned field hospitals and ambulance companies. Military police officers prepared traffic control posts. The headquarters building hummed with purposeful activity. The orchestrated chaos of hundreds of specialists executing a complex plan under time pressure. This was what staff work actually meant. Not theoretical planning, but practical translation of commanders' intent into executable operations. Not hoping things would work, but ensuring they couldn't fail. By evening of December 19th, orders were flowing down the chain of command through secure communication channels. Division commanders received telephone calls followed by written orders confirming what had been discussed in brief coded language. Many division commanders opened envelopes they'd been carrying for days, sealed orders marked to be opened on authentication code Nickel, and discovered they'd already anticipated half of what they were now being told to execute. Patton's insistence on contingency planning meant division staffs had warranted this pivot, had identified potential problems, had prepared solutions. When orders arrived directing 4th Armored Division to disengage from current operations and move north, the division operations officer pulled out a folder that detailed movement routes, phase lines, assembly areas, even specific roads to be used by specific units. What should have required days of planning required hours because the planning had already happened. December 20th, midnight. Across 3rd Army sector, engines roared to life. Tank crews performed pre-combat checks by flashlight, examining tracks, testing radios, loading ammunition. Infantry soldiers formed up in company formations, sergeants calling row, officers checking equipment, artillery units prepared to displace, carefully noting gun positions so they could be reoccupied if necessary, then limbering up and beginning road marches toward new positions 100 miles north. Supply trucks loaded with fuel, ammunition, and rations pulled into convoy formations. Maintenance crews worked frantically to repair vehicles that had been awaiting parts, knowing that anything left behind represented combat power that wouldn't reach. Bastogne medical personnel packed supplies and prepared ambulances. Chaplain held brief services for soldiers who wanted them. And across the entire front from the Saar to the Moselle, American forces began the complex dance of disengagement, pulling back from contact with German forces without allowing those forces to realize a major redeployment was underway. The logistics challenge was staggering, even by 3rd Army standards. 62,000 vehicles had to be moved, rerouted, or repositioned. 800,000 gallons of fuel had to be shifted from forward depot in the Saar region to new locations along the route to Bastogne. Artillery ammunition. 40,000 tons of shells had to be moved from storage areas to firing positions that didn't exist yet, but would need to be ready when divisions arrived. Ration supplies for 10 days of operations had to be prepositioned. Medical supplies had to be shifted closer to the anticipated battlefield. Communication wire had to be laid along new routes. And all of this had to happen while the army continued fighting in its current sector. Because German forces facing 3rd Army couldn't be allowed to realize American units were leaving, or they'd attack into the weakened positions. Military police officers established traffic control points at critical intersections, directing the flow of vehicles with the same choreographed precision as air traffic controllers. Main supply routes were designated one way to prevent gridlock. Priority systems determined who moved first. Combat units before support units. Armor before infantry before artillery before service troops. Maintenance crews positioned at intervals along routes to handle breakdowns before they caused traffic jams. Engineers cleared obstacles, reinforced bridges, marked detours around destroyed sections. This was the unglamorous face of modern warfare. The complicated logistics and traffic management that made rapid movement possible. A single broken down truck in the wrong place could stop an entire column for hours. A missed turn could send a battalion to the wrong assembly area. Poor traffic discipline could create chaos that enemy action couldn't match. December 20th, dawn. The 4th Armored Division's Combat Command began movement from positions near Saarbrücken. Tanks rolled in columns, maintaining intervals, following routes marked on maps and by military police at intersections. The division had been fighting continuously since August, had spearheaded 3rd Army's drive across France, and now was being asked to execute one more impossible mission. Soldiers didn't know their destination yet. Operational security meant details were compartmented, but they knew from the direction of march and the urgency of orders that something major was developing. Sherman tanks clattered through French villages where civilians waved and cheered, thinking this was an advance. It was just not in the direction anyone expected. The column stretched for miles, a river of steel and men flowing north toward roads that would take them to Belgium and battles they couldn't yet imagine. The 26th Infantry Division, nicknamed Yankee Division, began its pivot from positions near Metz. This was a National Guard division from Massachusetts. Citizen soldiers who trained together stateside, fought together through France, and now found themselves executing a maneuver that regular army divisions would find challenging. Company commanders explained the situation in terms soldiers could understand. Their buddies were surrounded in Bastogne. Germans were winning in the Ardennes. 3rd Army had been ordered to stop them, and that meant march now, fight later. Soldiers shouldered packs, formed columns, and began walking north. Snort's infantry covered 12 miles per day in good conditions. In winter weather on icy roads, carrying 4 combat loads. They'd be lucky to manage 8. They walked anyway, because orders said so, and because somewhere ahead Americans needed help. The 80th Infantry Division, the Blue Ridge Division from Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Virginia received movement orders and began its own redeployment. Like the 26th, this was a National Guard division, meaning pre-war civilians, not professional soldiers, that had proven itself in combat and was now being tested again. Division Commander, Brigadier General Horace McBride, briefed his regiment and battalion commanders with characteristic bluntness. The situation in the Ardennes was critical. Casualties would be heavy, winter conditions would be brutal, and success depended on every unit reaching its assembly area on schedule, and prepared to attack immediately upon arrival. No time for reconnaissance, no time for rest, just movement, assembly, and attack. The officers nodded understanding. This was what they'd trained for. This was why armies existed. They returned to their units and passed the word. By December 20th evening, 3rd Army was in motion across a 100-mile front from the air. If any aircraft had been able to fly in the miserable weather, it would have looked like a massive migration. Thousands of vehicles and tens of thousands of men all moving in organized chaos toward a single objective. On the ground, it felt like barely controlled pandemonium. Traffic jams at crossroads, units arriving at assembly areas to find them still occupied by other units, fuel shortages developing despite careful planning, communication failures as units moved beyond established wire networks, maintenance problems multiplying as vehicles operated beyond normal limits, and yet the machine held together, kept moving, kept functioning because staff work and discipline and soldier competence compensated for the inevitable friction of military operations. This was what Patton had built. This was what 3rd Army could do that other armies couldn't. This was the moment when preparation met opportunity, and produced something that looked from the outside like a miracle, but was actually just professionalism executed under pressure. The race to Bastogne was now a fact, irreversible, committed, and somewhere ahead, unknown distances away through German-held territory. Defenders in Bastogne were rationing ammunition and waiting for relief they'd been told was coming, but had no proof existed. December 21, 1944, dawn. The temperature gauge on Lieutenant Colonel Patton Abrams' command tank read 8 below zero far. As Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division began its approach to the Belgian border. Abrams, at 30 years old, one of the youngest battalion commanders in the European theatre, stood in his tank turret, watching the column behind him, Shermans and half-tracks and supply vehicles stretching back miles into morning darkness, and calculated distances, resistance factors, time 25 miles as the crow flies from their current position to Bastogne, closer to 40 by available roads, unknown German strength between here and there. Orders to attack immediately upon contact to break through, rather than become fixed in positional warfare to reach Bastogne by December 23, at the latest 48 hours to cover 40 miles through enemy territory in winter. Abrams had led armor attacks across France. He knew what roads could do to time-its. He knew what determined defenders in good terrain could do to armor. This wasn't going to be a dash. This was going to be a fight for every mile. The 4th Armored Division had earned its reputation as Patton's breakthrough unit. Through 6 months of continuous operations, from Normandy hedgerows, through Brittany and Lorraine, through Metz and toward the Saar, the division had been the spear point of 3rd Army's advance. Its soldiers knew their business, how to use terrain, how to coordinate infantry and armor, how to call artillery support, how to reduce strong points without getting fixed in place. But knowing and executing were different things, and executing in winter weather, against an enemy fighting on home approaches to their own territory, would test everything the division had learned. The roads approaching Belgium were narrow, winding through forests and villages lined with stone buildings that provided perfect defensive positions. Ice coated the pavement. Visibility was limited by fog and terrain, and intelligence about German positions was fragmentary at best. Reconnaissance hadn't had time to develop detailed pictures before the attack began. By midday, December 21st, Combat Command B reached the Belgian border near Ardennes and immediately ran into the friction that would define the entire relief operation. The roads, which had looked adequate on maps, proved barely capable of supporting two-way traffic. When vehicles met head-on, one column had to pull off into snow-filled ditches to let the other pass. Tanks attempting to negotiate icy inclines lost traction, treads spinning uselessly, while recovery vehicles struggled to position themselves in the limited space. A single breakdown could stop an entire column for an hour. And then there was the cold, which attacked men and machines with equal malice. Engine oil thickened, diesel fuel gelled. Tank crews discovered that metal surfaces at below zero temperatures could freeze exposed skin on contact. Infantry riding in half-tracks huddled under tarps that provided psychological comfort, but little actual warmth. Soldiers who'd fought through summer heat in France now learned what real cold meant. December 22nd, 6 o'clock in the morning. Armored Combat Command are attacking on a parallel axis. Hit the first serious German resistance near the village of Martelange. The Germans had blown the bridge over the Schur River and positioned anti-tank guns and infantry in buildings overlooking the crossing site. What should have been a routine advance became a deliberate attack, requiring engineers to ford the river under fire, infantry to clear buildings room by room, and tanks to provide supporting fire from positions with limited visibility. The attack consumed 6 hours and cost Combat Commander 40 casualties and 3 tanks. Before the village was secured and engineers could begin constructing a temporary bridge. 6 hours behind schedule after one village 30 miles still to go. Officers recalculated timets and didn't like the mathematics. At noon, Combat Commander attacked toward the town of Bernin and discovered that German defenders had learned lessons from years of war. The approaches to Bernin were mined. The village itself was fortified with mutually supporting positions, and waiting in concealed positions were tanks, not the obsolete models American crews had grown accustomed to defeating, but Panthers and at least 2 Tigers. The heavy tanks that could destroy Shermans at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The lead Sherman platoon rolled into the engagement zone and was hit almost immediately. One tank brewed up the terrible euphemism for catastrophic fire, killing its crew instantly. Another took a hit that penetrated armor but didn't ignite ammunition, leaving crew members wounded but alive if they could evacuate fast enough under continued fire. The column stopped, deployed, began the complicated process of locating enemy positions and bringing sufficient firepower to suppress them. The battle for Bernin demonstrated everything about tank warfare that training films didn't capture. It wasn't dramatic charges or heroic individual action. It was systematic, methodical application of combined arms technique. American tank destroyers moved forward to engage German armor at long range. Infantry advanced through adjacent woods to outflank German positions. Artillery observers call fire missions that drop shells into the village, forcing German infantry to shelter and preventing them from supporting their tanks. American Shermans, recognizing they couldn't penetrate Tiger armor frontally, maneuvered for flank shots while supporting tanks, provided suppressive fire. It took 4 hours to clear Bernin, and when the village finally fell, American crews counted the cost. 8 Shermans destroyed or disabled, 53 men killed or wounded, and the certain knowledge that this was just the beginning, that every village between here and Bastogne would present similar challenges. By evening of December 22nd, 4th Armored Division had advanced approximately 12 miles from its start line. 12 miles in 2 days. 13 miles still to go to Bastogne's perimeter through increasingly difficult terrain against German forces, who now understood an American relief column was coming and were repositioning to stop it. Division Commander, Major General Hugh Gaffey, studying his maps in a forward command post, made the calculations every commander dreads. At current rate of advance, 4th Armored would reach Bastogne sometime December 25th or 26th. Inside Bastogne, defenders had ammunition for perhaps 3 more days of heavy fighting. The timeline was too tight. German resistance was too effective. Something had to change, or the relief would arrive too late. December 23rd brought both curse and blessing. The curse was continued German resistance, now reinforced by elements of the 5th Parachute Division and Panzer Division that had been pulled from other sectors, specifically to stop 4th Armored advance. The blessing was weather. The overcast that had grounded Allied aircraft for a week finally broke. Patton's prayer for clear skies, delivered to 3rd Army chaplain days earlier, with instructions to circulate to all units, was answered with high-pressure systems moving in from the west. By 10 o'clock in the morning, P-47 Thunderbolts of the 19th Tactical Air Command were overhead diving on German positions, strafing road columns, dropping bombs and napalm on anything that looked like it might be supporting German defenses. For the first time since December 16th, American ground forces had air support, and the difference was immediate and overwhelming. Tank crews who'd been fighting through villages against prepared positions now called in airstrikes that suppressed German defenders before American troops even came in range. Artillery observers directed fighter bombers to targets beyond artillery range. German supply columns that had been moving with impunity during overcast weather were now caught in the open and destroyed by aircraft that could hunt at will. The psychological effect matched the tactical advantage. German soldiers who'd grown comfortable operating in daylight now had to take cover whenever they heard aircraft engines. American soldiers who'd felt abandoned by their air force during the wake of bad weather now watched P-47s work over German positions and felt hope that had been absent since the offensive began. The air-ground coordination that the Allies had perfected in Normandy and refined through months of operations was finally back in play. But air support couldn't eliminate all resistance, and 4th Armored continued to pay the price of advance. By December 23rd evening, the division had lost over 40 tanks destroyed or damaged badly enough to require evacuation. Over 400 men were dead, wounded, or missing. Companies that should have numbered 150 men were down to 90 or 100. tank platoon that should have had 5 vehicles operated with 3 or 4. Maintenance crews worked through darkness performing field repairs, cannibalizing damaged tanks for parts to keep running tanks operational. Medics treated wounded in aid stations that moved forward with the advance, establishing in captured German positions or Belgian farmhouses, then packing up and moving again hours later. The entire division was becoming worn, frayed, operating on determination and professionalism while physical exhaustion accumulated, and still they pushed north through the night of December 23rd into December 24th. Through Christmas Eve, when soldiers might normally have expected some pause in operations, 4th Armored continued attacking the villages of Wartintan and Bougainville fell after sharp fights. German counterattacks were beaten back. The division's 3 combat commands, A, B, and R, operated on separate axes, but coordinating fires, trying to find the weakness in German defenses that would allow breakthrough, rather than continued grinding advance. Officers studied maps by flashlight, identifying the next objective, the next phase line, the next obstacle. Soldiers grabbed sleep in shifts, 30 minutes here, an hour there, never enough. Tank crews learned to sleep in their vehicles during brief halts, learned to function on coffee and cigarettes and adrenaline, and somewhere ahead, close enough now that radio operators could occasionally pick up transmissions from bastions. Defenders, the surrounded garrison waited. 4th Armored was coming, but would they arrive before ammunition ran out? Before German attacks overwhelmed the perimeter? Before winter and casualties reduced the garrison below the strength needed to hold? Nobody knew. They just kept attacking, kept moving north, kept paying the price of each mile in blood and steel, trusting that speed and violence of action would eventually overcome friction and resistance. The road to Bastogne was indeed hell, but the only way to relieve the siege was to drive through hell without flinching, without stopping, without allowing the cost to become an excuse for failure. So they drove on. December 20, 1944 evening. Inside the perimeter at Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe walked a defensive line in gathering darkness, and made assessments that combined tactical analysis with brutal arithmetic. 15,000 American soldiers, paratroopers, tankers, artillery crews, engineers, and a collection of stragglers who'd found their way into the perimeter, held 16 miles of frozen ground, against German forces that intelligence estimated at 45,000 troops with over 250 tanks. The ratio should have been catastrophic. Basic military doctrine suggested defenders needed at least 3-to-1 advantage to hold prepared positions. Here, the ratio was reversed. McAuliffe had 1/3 the manpower defending against an enemy with 3 times the numbers, and overwhelming armor superiority. By every conventional measure, Bastogne should have fallen within 48 hours. That it wouldn't reflected something about American military capability that the Germans had consistently underestimated throughout the war. The secret was artillery. The 1001st Airborne had arrived with its own artillery battalions, light howitzers that paratroopers had learned to deploy rapidly and employ with devastating accuracy. But the garrison also included artillery units that had been near Bastogne. When the encirclement closed, regular Army field artillery battalions with heavier guns, longer range, more ammunition on hand. In total, 18 battalions, nearly 150 guns could mass fires on any point of the perimeter. American artillery doctrine, refined through years of war, emphasized forward observers positioned with infantry who could call fire missions directly, without waiting for approval from higher headquarters. This meant that, when German attacks developed, artillery fire could be concentrated on target within minutes, delivering tonnage that stopped attacks cold before they reached American lines. The Germans had infantry and tanks. The Americans had geometry, communication, and high explosive shells. December 21st morning brought the first formal German surrender demand. A delegation approached American lines under white flag, carrying a typed message with all the formal courtesy of 19th century warfare. The surrounded American forces were invited to surrender honorably to avoid total annihilation. The fortune of war had turned against them. Further resistance was senseless. 2 hours were allowed for response. The German officers who delivered this ultimatum seemed genuinely convinced. The Americans would accept. Why wouldn't they? They were surrounded, outnumbered, cut off from supply. Surrender was the logical military decision. What the Germans didn't understand was that American soldiers, particularly airborne units, had developed a particular culture around being surrounded. They jumped behind German lines in Normandy. They'd fought encircled in Holland. Being surrounded wasn't a crisis. It was Tuesday. McCauleffe's response entered military legend, not because it was eloquent, but because it was perfect. Reading the German demand, he tossed the paper aside and said a single word: nuts. His staff officers, tasked with translating this into formal military correspondence, produced a reply that combined brevity with absolute clarity to the German commander: nuts. The American commander, when German officers received this response, they required explanation of the term. The American officer delivering the message helpfully translated, "It means go to hell." The Germans withdrew. 2 hours later, their artillery opened up and the real siege began. The nuts story would be reported in American newspapers within days, would become a symbol of American defiance, would turn Bastogne from a military operation into a national cause. But inside the perimeter, soldiers didn't care about symbolism. They cared about ammunition counts, which were dropping faster than anyone wanted to admit. December 22nd brought intensified German attacks and the slow recognition that supplies were becoming critical. Artillery battalions, which had been firing without restriction, now received orders to ration shells. Infantry units counted rifle, ammunition, and distributed reserves to positions most likely to be attacked. Tank crews calculated fuel remaining and realized that if the siege continued, Many Shermans would be immobilized simply from empty tanks. Food supplies adequate for initial estimates proved insufficient. As the actual garrison size became clear, over 15,000 men needed to eat, and what had been planned as 3 days' rations would barely stretch to 2. Medical supplies, particularly morphine and bandages, were being consumed faster than planned because casualty rates exceeded estimates. In the 8 stations established in Belgian cellars, wounded lay on cold stone floors waiting for treatment that medics provided with increasingly limited resources. The cold was its own enemy. As destructive as German fire in some sectors, soldiers in foxholes stamped feet to maintain circulation, rubbed hands together, shared body heat in positions dug for 1 man, but occupied by 2. Because warmth mattered more than space, trench foot cases began appearing, the condition where prolonged cold and moisture caused tissue damage, sometimes requiring amputation. Frostbite turned fingers and toes black. Men who'd grown up in warm climates, who'd trained in American South before deployment, discovered that human bodies could stop functioning simply from temperature. Officers walked positions during night, checking that soldiers stayed awake, knowing that falling asleep in below zero weather was falling asleep forever. The cold sapped energy, slowed reaction times, made every task harder. Loading weapons with numb fingers, operating radios with frozen hands, walking patrol routes through snow that accumulated in drifts. Everything was harder, slower, more exhausting. December 23rd brought the weather break that changed everything. The overcast that had grounded aircraft and protected German movements finally lifted. By mid-morning, C-47 transport planes appeared overhead, circling the perimeter at 3,000 feet. Doors open, cargo bundles tumbling out attached to red, white, and blue parachutes. The first supply drop since encirclement began. Soldiers in foxholes stopped fighting long enough to watch parachutes blossom and drift down, praying that German artillery wouldn't bracket the drop zones, that the bundles would land inside the perimeter, that the supplies they desperately needed were actually aboard. The drops were extraordinarily accurate. Over 95% of bundles landed within American lines. Each bundle contained ammunition, medical supplies, or food prioritized based on what McAuliffe's staff had requested. By evening, over 240 tons of supplies had been delivered, enough to extend the defense for several more days. But supply drops couldn't eliminate the most serious shortage: medical evacuation. 600 wounded men filled aid stations and cellars, many requiring surgery that couldn't be performed in field conditions, all of them taking up space, requiring care, consuming medical supplies. The seriously wounded needed evacuation to rear area hospitals, but no evacuation was possible while the perimeter remained closed. Medical officers performed triage with increasing desperation. This man could wait. That man needed immediate surgery. This other man was beyond help and received morphine to ease his dying. Surgeons operated by lamplight in Belgian cellars with stone walls and dirt floors, performing procedures that should have happened in sterile operating rooms. With full medical teams, they amputated frozen limbs. They removed shrapnel. They tied off bleeding arteries. They did what they could with what they had. And they watched men die who might have survived in different circumstances. December 24th, Christmas Eve, brought the largest German attack since encirclement began. The German command, recognizing that relief columns were approaching from the south, decided to reduce Bastogne immediately rather than wait for it to surrender through attrition. Infantry supported by tanks hit the western perimeter in regimental strength, attacking through snow in early morning darkness. American defenders fought from positions they'd occupied 4 days, knew the terrain intimately, had pre-registered artillery coordinates for every likely approach. The attack developed, pressed forward, ran into walls of artillery fire that stopped its 600s from American foxholes. German infantry went to ground. Tanks halted, unwilling to advance without infantry support. American artillery observers adjusted fire, walking shells back and forth across German positions, sustaining fires for hours. By afternoon, the attack had failed and German forces withdrew. leaving hundreds of dead in the snow. The psychological impact of defeating that attack exceeded the tactical significance. Soldiers who'd been defending for days against mounting pressure, who'd been rationing ammunition and wondering if relief would arrive in time, now realized they could hold indefinitely if supplies continued to arrive by air. The Germans had thrown everything they had at one sector and been repulsed. The perimeter held. The siege continued, but the balance had shifted subtly from American defenders wondering if they could survive to German attackers wondering if they could win before relief arrived. Inside Bastogne, McAuliffe issued a Christmas message to his troops that acknowledged their situation without sugar, quoting it, "Merry Christmas. What's merry about all this, you ask? We're fighting. It's cold. We aren't home." All true. But what has the proud Eagle Division accomplished with its worthy comrades from the 10th Armored Division, the 7,005th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and all the rest? Just this: we have stopped cold everything that has been thrown at us. And then the kicker. The line that told soldiers relief was coming. Allied troops are counterattacking in force. We continue to hold Bastogne. By holding Bastogne, we assure the success of the Allied armies they'd been told to hold. They'd held. Now someone else's job was to break through. And somewhere south of the perimeter, close enough now that soldiers could hear artillery fire from both directions, 4th Armored Division was fighting toward them through German defenses that grew stronger by the hour. December 20th, 1944, in a meteorology office attached to 9th Air Force Headquarters, weathermen studied charts showing atmospheric pressure systems across Western Europe and delivered forecasts that spelled disaster for American operations. Low pressure centered over the British Isles, dense cloud cover from the deck to 15,000 feet, freezing precipitation, zero visibility, wind from the west keeping the overcast locked in place. Expected duration indefinite, possibly through December 25th. 4 infantry and armor fighting on the ground. This was merely miserable weather. 4 air forces that had dominated European skies since Normandy, that had turned tactical air support into a science, that had made movement of German forces in daylight suicidal. This weather was as effective as losing the entire air force. German commanders had timed their offensive to coincide with this weather. They'd studied meteorological records, identified the pattern, and attacked during the one window when Allied air power would be neutralized. It was brilliant strategic planning combined with meteorological luck. And it was working, snorts General George Patton, who believed in practical solutions to tactical problems, but also maintained a complicated relationship with divine providence. Decided to address the weather through channels, both military and spiritual. On December 22nd, he summoned 3rd Army Chaplain James O'Neill and posed a question that O'Neill would remember for the rest of his life. "Chaplain, I want you to publish a prayer for good weather. I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans. See if we can't get God to work on our side." O'Neill, accustomed to Patton's unconventional requests, pointed out that most prayers requested intervention in matters of life and death, not meteorological conditions. Patton's response was characteristically direct. "Chaplain, are you teaching me theology or are you the chaplain of the 3rd Army? I want a prayer." O'Neill drafted a prayer that afternoon, walking the line between genuine religious sentiment and practical military necessity. The result was a 100-word invocation that asked for fair weather to enable Allied forces to secure victory. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains, with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power, we may advance from victory to victory, and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies, and establish thy justice among men and nations." It was theology crafted for military purpose, faith weaponized for tactical advantage. Patton approved it immediately and ordered 250,000 copies printed on cards that would be distributed to every soldier in 3rd Army. The prayer went out December 23rd with instructions that it be read in all units. December 23rd, dawn. The weather began to change. High-pressure systems that meteorologists hadn't predicted with confidence started moving in from the west. The solid overcast that had covered the Ardennes for 8 days began to break. By mid-morning, patches of blue appeared. By noon, the cloud ceiling had lifted to 5,000 feet. By afternoon, it was clear enough for aircraft operations, and what followed was an aerial campaign that demonstrated exactly why the Germans had feared Allied air power so desperately. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 19th Tactical Air Command took off from bases in France and Belgium, formed up and headed for the Ardennes. Their orders were simple: destroy anything German moving on roads, attack any concentration of vehicles or troops, interdict supply lines, support ground forces wherever requested. The pilots, who'd been grounded and frustrated for over a week, went hunting with enthusiasm born of professional pride and personal anger. The impact was immediate and devastating. German supply columns that had been moving in daylight during the overcast weather were now caught in the open on roads covered with snow that made camouflage impossible. The P-47's dove from 5,000 feet lined up on convoys and fired rockets and 50 caliber machine guns that turned trucks into burning wrecks and killed soldiers who had nowhere to hide. German tanks moving toward the front were spotted from the air and attacked before they could reach combat zones. Artillery positions that had been firing with impunity were identified from above and bombed or strafed. Command posts housed in buildings were targeted and destroyed. The Luftwaffe, which had managed to fly limited missions during overcast conditions, now found itself outnumbered 20-1 and lost aircraft faster than experienced pilots could be replaced. By December 24th, Allied air forces were flying over 2,000 sorties per day across the Ardennes sector. The sky belonged to the Allies again, and German forces paid the price. The tactical air support system that had been developed through months of operations in France, now deployed in full effect around Bastogne. Forward air controllers positioned with ground units communicated directly with aircraft overhead, using radio frequencies that allowed real-time targeting. A tank commander encountering German armor could call for air support and have P-47s overhead within 15 minutes, attacking the exact coordinates provided. Artillery observers spotted German positions beyond artillery range and directed fighter bombers to targets with precision that exceeded what heavy bombers could achieve at high altitude. The air-ground coordination was so effective that German commanders reported their troops were suffering more casualties from air attack than from ground combat. Movement during daylight became effectively impossible. German units went nocturnal, trying to move supplies and reinforcements only after dark, which cut their operational tempo by more than half. But clear weather was a double-edged sword, and the edge cut both ways. The same conditions that allowed Allied aircraft to dominate also brought temperatures that dropped below 0 Fahrenheit at night. Roads that had been muddy ice during overcast weather now froze solid, which actually helped tank movement, but made life for infantry utterly miserable. Soldiers who'd been wet and cold were now dry and colder, with wind chill driving effective temperatures to 20 and 30 below 0. Metal weapons and equipment became so cold that touching them with bare skin caused instant frostbite. Water froze in canteens. Rations froze solid and had to be thawed before eating. Vehicle engines had to be run periodically through the night, or they wouldn't start in morning. The clear skies that brought air support also brought killing cold that was in some ways harder to endure than German fire. December 24th, Christmas Eve. American soldiers looked up at clear skies and saw something they'd been promised for 8 days. Hope made visible. Not abstract hope, but concrete physical evidence that their military system was functioning again, that the overwhelming advantages they'd enjoyed since Normandy were back in play. Every contrail overhead represented American or British aircraft. Every explosion visible in German rear areas represented supplies that wouldn't reach German forward units. Every German soldier diving for cover, when he heard aircraft engines, was a German soldier, not shooting at Americans. The weather had broken, and with it German hopes of reaching their objectives. Before Allied reinforcements arrived, the offensive that had depended on weather to neutralize Allied air power now faced the full weight of that air power brought to bear. Patton's prayer became part of Third Army legends cited in after-action reports, mentioned in soldier letters, home reported in newspaper articles. Whether divine intervention or meteorological coincidence, the timing was remarkable enough that even skeptics acknowledged the psychological impact. Soldiers who carried the prayer card believed or wanted to believe that someone was listening, that their commander had connections that extended beyond military channels. Patton himself maintained careful ambiguity about whether he believed the prayer had worked, or whether he'd simply understood that soldiers fight better when they believe God is on their side. In his diary, he noted simply, "The weather cleared." But in speeches to his troops, he was more direct. "I knew the prayer would work. I had faith." And whether that faith was in God or in high-pressure meteorological systems mattered less than the result. Clear skies, air superiority, and German forces suddenly exposed to the full weight of Allied military power. The Luftwaffe made one final desperate effort on December 23rd and 24th, throwing their remaining reserves into combat missions that were essentially suicide runs. German pilots flew knowing they faced overwhelming numerical disadvantage, knowing that even if they survived their missions, they probably wouldn't survive the war, knowing that the fuel they were burning represented reserves that would never be replaced. They flew anyway out of duty or desperation or the simple momentum of military organizations that continue functioning even after strategic defeat has become inevitable. Some got through to bomb American positions. Most were intercepted and shot down by American fighters that patrolled in strength and operated with radar guidance. By December 25th, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as an operational force over the Ardennes. The skies belonged to the Allies. The weather gods, whether divine or meteorological, had sided with the Americans, and 4th Armored Division, attacking toward Bastogne under clear skies with air support available on call, was about to discover whether clear weather would be enough to break through German defenses that had held for 6 days. December 23, 1944, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Major Charles Tier, 3rd Army Logistics Officer, stood in a supply depot outside Nancy and contemplated a crisis that couldn't be solved by shooting. 4th Armored Division attacking north had just radioed that fuel levels were critical. Tanks were running on fumes, and without immediate resupply, the entire division would grind to a halt within hours. The problem wasn't lack of fuel. Depots held hundreds of thousands of gallons, but moving that fuel 100 miles forward over roads clogged with military traffic, through winter weather to units that were advancing faster than supply lines could follow. Basic military logistics said that every mile an army advance stretched its supply line and increased the time and resources needed to keep combat units functioning. 4th Armored had advanced 12 miles in 2 days, which shouldn't have been a problem, except they'd advanced through territory with destroyed bridges, cratered roads, and limited infrastructure, while simultaneously consuming fuel at combat rates that exceeded normal planning factors. The solution was improvisation on a scale that logistics textbooks didn't cover. Tier ordered fuel trucks to bypass normal distribution points and drive directly to 4th Armored's location, delivering directly to tank companies rather than to division supply points. He commandeered transport aircraft from supply drop missions and had them fly jerry cans of fuel forward, dropping them by parachute to forward units. He stripped fuel from units not in contact with enemy and reallocated it to the attack. He authorized emergency fuel economy measures. Only essential vehicles would operate. Tanks would run at reduced speed between combat actions. Engines would be shut down during halts rather than idling. It was the kind of supply management that worked only because everyone involved understood the stakes and accepted inefficiency and risk as the cost of maintaining operational tempo. Fuel trucks drove through darkness without escorts, vulnerable to German attack, but necessary because tanks without fuel were just expensive pillboxes. The fuel crisis was just one example of logistics problems, multiplying faster than solutions could be implemented. Ammunition expenditure exceeded every planning estimate. Third Army was firing more artillery shells per day than had been anticipated for weekly consumption. The 4th Armored Division alone was using 100 tons of ammunition, daily tank rounds, artillery shells, a small arms cartridges, anti-tank rockets, grenades. Multiply that across 3 divisions attacking simultaneously, plus the units still engaged in the SAR, and the numbers became staggering. Supply officers calculated that 3rd Army needed 250,000 artillery rounds per day just to sustain current operations. Ammunition ships were still unloading at Normandy beaches in Cherbourg, 300 meters from the fighting. Trucks drove 24-hour shifts, hauling ammunition forward, wearing out vehicles and drivers at rates that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. The Red Bull Express, the famous truck convoy system that had supplied the advance across France, was revived and expanded for the Ardennes operation. Predominantly African-American truck companies drove continuous shifts from coastal depots to forward supply points following routes marked with Red Bulls, operating under traffic priority that gave them right-of-way over everything except ambulances. The drivers, many of them dealing with segregation and discrimination in their own military, drove anyway because wounded Americans needed ammunition and someone had to deliver it. They drove through ice storms and darkness, through German territory where one wrong turn could mean capture, through conditions that killed some in accidents and exhausted all the rest. By Christmas Eve, the Red Bull Express was moving over 800 tons of supplies daily to 3rd Army, sustaining an offensive that by all normal standards should have ground to halt from logistical strangulation. Medical evacuation presented its own complications. 3rd Army was taking 2,000 casualties per day, killed, wounded, missing. The wounded required evacuation from forward areas to field hospitals to rear hospitals, a system that demanded ambulances, roads, and medical personnel at every stage. But the roads were needed for moving troops and supplies forward. Ambulances had to wait in traffic jams alongside ammunition trucks and tank convoys. Field hospitals established in captured buildings or tents found themselves nearly overrun. As front lines shifted, surgeons operated continuously, 60 and 70 hours without sleep, performing procedures that saved lives but couldn't save all of them. The wounded who survived surgery needed evacuation further rear for recovery, but transport was limited and priorities had to be set. This man could travel immediately. That man needed stabilization first. This other man wouldn't survive transport and would stay in forward hospitals that weren't equipped for long-term care. The maintenance crisis compounded every other problem. Tanks and trucks and half-tracks were operating beyond normal limits, driving through conditions that accelerated wear, fighting through combat that damaged vehicles faster than repair could fix them. At any given time, 30% of 3rd Army's armored vehicles were deadlined, broken, and requiring repair. Recovery vehicles worked around the clock, pulling damaged tanks off roads, towing them to maintenance collection points, cannibalizing some to provide parts for others. Mechanics performed repairs in open fields in below-zero weather, their hands numb, their tools too cold to touch without gloves, working by flashlight and determination. A tank transmission that should have required 8 hours to replace in a maintenance depot was being replaced in 3 hours by field maintenance crews who knew that delay meant another tank out of action, another crew without their vehicle, another reduction in combat power. The infantry faced their own grinding logistics, replacement troops trying to join units that were moving faster than the replacement system could track. New soldiers arrived at assembly areas to find their units had already moved out, left messages about new locations, changed plans without being able to inform rear echelon. Food supply, supposedly guaranteed 3 meals per day, became one hot meal if you were lucky, and cold rations if you weren't eaten on the move, because there wasn't time to stop. Uniform supply couldn't keep pace with need. Soldiers were fighting in summer-filled jackets because winter coats hadn't reached forward units. Some soldiers wore German coats taken from prisoners or dead. Others wrapped themselves in blankets. Trench cases multiplied not from lack of knowledge about prevention, but from lack of dry socks, lack of time to care for feet properly, lack of opportunity to warm and dry boots. December 24th brought all these problems to simultaneous crisis. 4th Armored needed fuel and ammunition. 26th Infantry needed food and replacement boots. 80th Infantry needed medical supplies and winter clothing. Artillery units needed shells and replacement barrels for guns that had fired so many rounds. They were wearing out. Everyone needed mail from home, which might seem trivial compared to ammunition, but which mattered to morale in ways that couldn't be quantified. And underlying all of it was the simple grinding reality that supplying an army fighting a 100 miles from its depots through winter weather over inadequate roads was an impossible task that had to be accomplished anyway, because failure meant soldiers died from lack of supplies rather than enemy action. 3rd Army logistics officers worked with a desperation born from understanding consequences. They authorized emergency measures that would horrify peacetime supply officers, bypassing normal requisition procedures, liberating supplies from other units, trading and bartering between units to move resources where needed immediately. They stripped rear echelon units of vehicles to create additional transport capacity. They flew cargo planes designed for training missions on supply runs. Because every available aircraft mattered, they made decisions that balanced competing priorities, knowing that every choice meant someone didn't get what they needed. Give fuel to 4th Armored meant less fuel for units in the SAR. Give ammunition to artillery meant less ammunition for infantry. Give medical supplies to forward hospitals meant less for rear hospitals. Everything was triage. Everything was ruthless calculation about relative importance. Everything required accepting that perfect supply was impossible, and adequate supply was the best achievable outcome. And yet the machine kept functioning. Fuel reached tanks before they ran completely dry. Ammunition arrived before units exhausted reserves. Medical supplies got to field hospitals before surgeons ran out of critical items. Not perfectly, not abundantly, but adequately, barely. Just enough to keep the offensive moving. This was the unglamorous reality behind Patton's dramatic promises and 4th Armor's heroic attacks. Thousands of supply officers and truck drivers and maintenance crews performing tasks that would never make headlines, but without which nothing else would have been possible. The miracle of Bastogne wasn't just tanks breaking through German lines. It was jerry cans of fuel arriving at 3 o'clock in the morning, so those tanks could move at dawn. It was ammunition trucks driving through darkness, so artillery could fire when called. It was mechanics replacing tank tracks in below zero weather, so vehicles would be ready for the next attack. The grinding gears of modern warfare, unsexy and essential, keeping the whole magnificent, terrible machine moving forward toward a town full of surrounded soldiers who needed relief, and needed it soon because their own supply situation was becoming critical, and nobody knew how much longer they could hold. December 22, 1944, dawn. Private First Class Robert Evans of the 26th Infantry Division stood in a frozen field outside the Belgian village of Arsdorf and learned what infantry combat actually meant. Not the training film version, with clear objectives and enemy positions marked on maps, but the real thing. House-to-house fighting in a village where German soldiers fought from cellars and attics, where every door might hide a machine gun, where walls provided concealment but not cover, because German anti-tank guns could put rounds through stone like it was paper. Evans and his squad were advancing behind a Sherman tank that was methodically putting high-explosive shells into buildings before infantry cleared them, reducing homes to rubble in the process of making them safe enough to occupy. The civilians who lived here were gone, fled or evacuated or dead. It didn't matter which, because the village was now just trying to be taken and held. By evening, Arsdorf would be in American hands. By evening, Evans would have killed his first German soldier and seen 2 men from his squad die and learned that war was mostly terror, punctuated by brief moments of action that would replay in memory forever. The 26th Division, the Yankee Division, New England National Guardsmen who trained together stateside and deployed together, was fighting its way north on a parallel axis to 4th Armored, where 4th Armored had tanks and mobility, 26 had infantry and grim determination. Where 4th Armored could bypass strongpoints, 26 had to reduce them because bypassing meant leaving German forces astride supply routes that 3rd Army needed open. The division's mission was unglamorous: clear villages, secure roads, protect 4th Armor's eastern flank, absorb German counterattacks that might otherwise hit the Armor's more vulnerable supply lines. It was infantry work in the oldest sense, walking into enemy fire, clearing positions 1 room at a time, holding ground once taken. No dramatic breakthrough, no headlines, just the slow bloody business of fighting for every 100 yards. The 80th Infantry Division, the Blue Ridge Division, Penions and West Virginians and Virginians, fought their own battle on 3rd Army's eastern flank. Their mission was even less glamorous than 26. Hold the line against German counterattacks while other units advanced toward Bastogne. The 80th dug in along the Shaw River and prepared to defend against German units that recognized 3rd Army's offensive had created a vulnerable flank and were attacking to exploit it. On December 23, German forces hit 80th Division positions in strength, seeking to penetrate and disrupt the entire relief operation. The battle lasted 16 hours and consisted mostly of German attacks, stopped by American defensive fires. Artillery dug in and registered on pre-planned targets, broke up attacks before they reached American lines. Infantry fighting from prepared positions with good fields of fire engaged at ranges, where American firepower advantage could be decisive. By evening, the German counterattack had failed, leaving hundreds of dead in the snow. But having achieved nothing except demonstrating that 3rd Army's flanks were secure, the infantry experience was fundamentally different from the tankers' experience in ways that official histories didn't always capture. Tank crews fought from inside steel vehicles, protected from small arms fire, mobile, capable of rapid movement between positions. Infantry walked through enemy fire with nothing but cloth uniforms for protection. Tank crews saw battlefield through periscopes and viewports, limited fields of view that reduced war to what could be seen through optical systems. Infantry saw everything: the frozen dead, the wounded crying for medics, the destroyed buildings and burning vehicles, and all the other evidence of what high explosives did to human bodies and human construction. Tank crews could button up inside vehicles and isolate themselves psychologically. Infantry lived in the environment, slept in holes in frozen ground, ate while under fire, defecated in hasty latrines dug by shovel. It was intimate and terrible in ways that no training could fully prepare anyone for. December 24th, the infantry divisions continued their grinding advance. 26th Division cleared the villages of Rambrush and Gosp, taking casualties in street fighting that offered no glory and minimal tactical advantage, but which protected 4th Armored supply lines from German interdiction. 80th Division held against repeated German counterattacks, giving ground grudgingly where necessary, counterattacking immediately to restore positions when possible, maintaining the defensive line that kept 3rd Army's eastern flank secure. These were not dramatic operations. They would not feature prominently in newspaper accounts, but without them, 4th Armored's attack toward Bastogne would have been impossible, because armor without secure flanks and open supply routes was just targets waiting to be destroyed. The casualty rates told the story that press releases didn't. Infantry divisions were taking 60% of 3rd Army's casualties, despite being only 40% of its combat strength. A rifle company that deployed with 190 men might have 120 effectives after a week of combat. Some companies were down to 70 or 80 men, still expected to hold the same frontage and execute the same missions. Platoon that should have numbered 44 soldiers operated with 25 or 30. Squad leaders became platoon leaders. Privates became squad leaders. Everyone did jobs they hadn't trained for because casualties had created vacancies that experience couldn't fill, and still they advanced. Still they fought because orders said so, and because soldiers who trained together and deployed together and fought together developed bonds stronger than self-preservation. The recognition gap between armor and infantry bothered no one in command, but frustrated soldiers who saw tanks celebrated while infantry died in anonymous villages. 4th Armored Division was becoming famous. Newspapers ran stories about the breakthrough, about tankers racing to rescue paratroopers, about dramatic battles against German panzers. 26th and 80th Divisions fought with equal courage and suffered heavier casualties, but received minimal press coverage because their operations didn't fit the dramatic narrative editors wanted. Infantry clearing villages wasn't photogenic. Infantry holding defensive lines wasn't exciting. Infantry protecting supply routes wasn't the stuff of headlines. But it was essential and glamorous work that enabled everything else to happen. Officers tried to maintain morale by emphasizing mission importance even when recognition was absent. Division commanders visited forward positions, spoke to soldiers, explained how their operations fit into larger strategy. Battalion commanders made clear that 4th Armored success depended on infantry protecting their flanks and supply lines. Company commanders told soldiers the truth. They were fighting and dying for objectives that might never be famous, but which mattered just as much as any dramatic breakthrough. Some soldiers accepted this, others didn't. All continued fighting because military discipline and unit cohesion kept men in positions, even when personal desire was to be anywhere else. December 25th, Christmas Day, brought no pause in operations. While 4th Armored Division approached Bastogne's perimeter, while newspapers prepared stories about the climactic relief, 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions continued their unglamorous missions. 26th cleared more villages, took more casualties, secured more supply routes. 80th held its defensive line, repulsed more German counterattacks, protected 3rd Army's flank. Soldiers who'd hoped for a Christmas pause, who'd imagined hot food and rest and maybe a religious service, instead spent the day in combat. Some officers conducted brief services between fights, reading prayers over frozen ground, while artillery rumbled in the distance. Some soldiers opened packages from home, received gifts their families had mailed weeks earlier, allowed themselves moments of connection with a world that seemed impossibly distant. From Belgian villages and German bullets, the infantry story of the Bastogne relief was one of cumulative small actions that added up to strategic effect. No single battle that 26th or 80th fought was decisive. No single village cleared or counterattack repulsed changed the war's outcome. But collectively, continuously, these divisions made possible the operation that history would remember. 4th Armored broke through to Bastogne because infantry divisions protected their flanks. Artillery fire was effective because infantry divisions held observation posts. Supply lines functioned because infantry divisions cleared routes and held them against German interdiction. The relief of Bastogne was a combined arms operation in the truest sense. Different units with different capabilities, all executing missions that enabled others to succeed. 4th Armored got the headlines. 26th and 80th got casualty reports and orders for new operations, that they continued performing excellently. Despite recognition, disparity testified to professionalism and unit pride that transcended individual credit. They knew what they'd done. Their officers knew. Their dead knew. Where the history remembered didn't change the mathematics of military operations. Bastogne would be relieved because an entire army, not just one armored division, had fought to make it happen, and the soldiers of 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions walking through frozen Belgian forests toward the next objective were content to let the tanks take credit. as long as the mission succeeded and the war moved toward ending. December 26, 1944, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Lieutenant Charles Bogus sat in the turret of his Sherman tank call sign Cobra King, and studied the village of Assiniboine through binoculars that magnified both detail and danger. The village sat astride the road to Bastogne 4 miles from the perimeter, final obstacle before breakthrough. Intelligence suggested moderate German defenses, infantry dug in, anti-tank guns positioned, but nothing that coordinated armor and infantry assault couldn't reduce. Behind Bogus' tank, the remainder of combat, Command Reserve, 4th Armored Division was forming up for what everyone understood was the culminating attack of the entire relief operation. 7 days of fighting, hundreds of casualties, 40 miles of winter warfare. Everything had led to this moment, this village, this last push to reach surrounded paratroopers who'd been holding alone for 6 days, and whose ammunition and endurance were both running critically low. The plan was simple, because complicated plans broke down under combat stress. Artillery would prep the village with 15 minutes of sustained fire. Then armor would attack straight through the main street, while infantry cleared buildings on either side. No finesse, no maneuver. Just overwhelming application of firepower and violence of action designed to get through German positions before they could establish coordinated defense. Bogus commanded Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, 5 Shermans that would lead the assault. He knew the odds. Attacking into a village meant exposing tanks to close-range anti-tank fire from positions that tanks couldn't effectively engage. It meant accepting casualties as the price of speed. It meant trusting the infantry following could clear positions before Germans organized counterattack. It was the kind of mission arm officers dreaded and executed anyway, because someone had to be first and leadership meant taking the risks you ordered others to take. 4 o'clock artillery fire lifted. Bogus' tank lurched forward, engine roaring, treads biting into frozen ground. The other 4 Shermans of his company followed in column, maintaining intervals. Each crew alert for anti-tank guns, 4 Panzers, 4 German armor. Infantry squads advanced alongside in half-tracks, ready to dismount and clear buildings once armor suppressed initial resistance. The formation hit the village outskirts and immediately took fire. A Panzer round streaked past Bogus' turret, missing by feet. Machine gun fire rattled off the Sherman's hull. The tank's main gun fired. High explosive round, punching through a building where the Panzer Faust had launched from, collapsing the structure into rubble. The tank kept moving, kept firing. Each shot aimed at anything that looked like it might hide German soldiers. The fight through Assiniboine lasted 45 minutes and felt like hours. Buildings burned. German infantry fought from cellars and then died when American tanks put 75mm rounds through walls. At point-blank range, anti-tank guns fired and missed as tankers spotted muzzle flashes, and returned fire faster than German crews could reload. American infantry dismounted from half-tracks and went building to building, clearing with grenades and rifles and the brutal efficiency of soldiers who'd done this dozens of times. Casualties mounted, soldiers shot by snipers, tank hit by anti-tank gun and left burning, half-track disabled, and crew killed trying to evacuate. But the assault maintained momentum, kept pushing forward, sacrificed elegance for speed, because speed was what Baston's defenders needed. 445 Bogus tank broke through the far side of Assiniboine. Behind him, the village was still being cleared. But ahead, the road to Bastogne stretched open. This was the moment where tactical doctrine said, stop, consolidate, wait for main body. But Bogus had heard radio traffic from Bastogne. He knew the garrison was low on everything. He knew every hour delayed was an hour Germans might use to cut the corridor, or launch final assault on Bastogne's perimeter. He made the decision that would put him in history books. He didn't stop. He ordered his 4 remaining tanks, one had been knocked out in Assiniboine, to follow him and race toward Bastogne at maximum speed, leaving the rest of combat command reserve behind, charging through territory that might still hold German positions. betting everything on surprise and audacity. The 4-mile run from Airdennes to Bastogne was the longest short distance Bogus ever traveled. His tank roared down the road at 20 miles per hour. Maximum speed on frozen pavement, treads throwing snow, engines straining, crew scanning for threats that could destroy them in seconds. German soldiers appeared at roadside as surprised to see American tanks. As the tanks were to see them, some fired rifles that couldn't penetrate armor. Some just stared. Some ran. Bogus gunner fired machine guns at anything that moved. Not taking chances, not slowing down. The tanks passed abandoned German vehicles, supply dumps, soldiers cooking dinner who scattered as Shermans appeared. This was the chaos of breakthrough, the moment when penetration became exploitation, when front lines ceased to exist and combat became a race to reach objectives. Before enemy could respond, 450 Bogus saw the first American positions, paratroopers in foxholes, weapons trained on his tank until someone recognized Sherman silhouettes and realized these weren't German. Bogus stood in his turret and shouted the words that every soldier in Bastogne had been waiting to hear. "Come here." This is the 4th Armored Paratroopers, emerged from positions looking like they'd been through hell, unshaven, exhausted, uniforms filthy but grinning with relief that was visible even at distance. Officers ran forward. Someone had a radio. Communication established with Bastogne command confirmed what was obvious. The corridor was open. Relief had arrived. The siege that had consumed national attention for a week, that had symbolized American determination and German desperation, was over. Technically over at least. The corridor was open but vulnerable. Supply still needed to flow. Fighting would continue, but the fundamental equation had changed. Bastogne's defenders were no longer alone. The handshake between tankers and paratroopers, captured by combat photographers who'd followed the relief column, became one of the war's iconic images. Exhausted men from different units, different backgrounds, different military cultures, clasping hands over the fact of survival and successful relief. The paratroopers had held when doctrine said surrounded forces should surrender. The tankers had broken through when every mole suggested maybe they wouldn't. Together, they'd achieved something that newspapers would call miraculous, but which was actually the product of training, determination, and willingness to pay whatever price the mission demanded. Bogus and his crew had driven through German positions to reach Bastogne. Thousands of other soldiers had fought for 7 days to create the conditions that made that drive possible. The breakthrough was individual action enabled by collective effort. By 5 o'clock, the first supply vehicles were moving through the corridor. Half-tracks carrying ammunition, trucks with medical supplies, ambulances ready to evacuate wounded. The narrow ribbon of road from Airdennes to Bastogne became the most important real estate in the European theatre, a corridor barely 250 yards wide at its narrowest point under German observation, and fire from surrounding high ground, but open and functional and sufficient for immediate needs. Engineers worked through twilight, widening the road, clearing obstacles, establishing detours around destroyed vehicles. Military police directed traffic. Combat units moved into positions flanking the corridor, preparing to defend against inevitable German attempts to cut it. The breakthrough was complete, but holding what had been won would require sustained effort and additional casualties. Inside Bastogne, the mood shifted instantly from desperate determination to exhausted relief. Soldiers who'd been rationing ammunition and wondering how much longer they could hold now learned they could hold indefinitely, because supplies were arriving. The wounded who'd been waiting in aid stations for evacuation that might never come were now being loaded into ambulances for the ride to rear hospitals. Fresh troops were arriving to reinforce positions. Hot food was being distributed. First hot food in days for some soldiers. Chaplain held services of Thanksgiving. Officers drafted reports documenting the siege. And everyone from McAuliffe in headquarters to privates in foxholes processed the reality that they'd survived something that might easily have ended differently. The relief of Bastogne would enter military legend as American triumph. For the soldiers who'd lived it, it was simpler and more complicated. They'd been given an impossible mission, had accomplished it through methods both professional and improvised, and were now ready to move on to whatever impossible mission came next. The war wasn't over. The fighting would continue, but this battle, this siege, this demonstration of what American forces could accomplish when properly led and adequately determined was finished. 4th Armored had reached Bastogne. Bostonians' defenders had held until relief arrived, and George Patton, sitting in his headquarters, receiving reports of breakthrough, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before turning to the next problem, the next operation, the next demonstration that 3rd Army could do what others said was impossible. December 27, 1944, dawn. Sergeant William Harper of the 7,002nd Tank Battalion stood beside a knocked-out Sherman on the road between Arsène-Noir and Bastogne and counted bullet holes in the surrounding ground. 37 distinct impact points within 10 feet of the tank, each representing a German artillery or mortar round that had landed during the night. The corridor was open. Relief had arrived, but the Germans hadn't given up. They'd simply shifted tactics from preventing relief to cutting the corridor, and their artillery dominated the high ground on both sides of the narrow road that represented Bastogne's only connection to the outside world. Harper's job this morning was to help recover the destroyed Sherman, clear it from the road, restore traffic flow that German fire had disrupted overnight. It was maintenance work conducted under enemy observation, knowing that any moment German artillery observers might spot the recovery operation and call fire missions that would turn this section of road into a kill zone. The corridor that Bogus had opened was less than 250 yards wide at its narrowest point. German positions on high ground overlooked it from both sides. Every vehicle traveling the corridor was visible to German observers. Every convoy presented a target, and the Germans, recognizing they'd lost the battle for Bastogne, but unwilling to concede defeat, poured artillery fire into the corridor continuously. Supply convoys ran a gauntlet. Drivers accelerated to maximum speed, raced through the corridor, hoped German artillery wouldn't bracket them during the minute or two they were exposed. Some made it through unscathed. Others took hits, were destroyed, blocked the road until recovery teams cleared them. The corridor earned its nickname, honestly the corridor of death, where relief had arrived, but survival remained uncertain. December 27th brought the first systematic German attempts to cut the corridor. Infantry attacks supported by armor hit positions flanking the road, seeking to push American defenders back far enough to make the corridor unusable. The attacks hit 4th Armored Division positions east of Bastogne, where Combat Commander held terrain recently captured. The fighting was brutal, close range, decided by which side could mass firepower faster. American artillery, now positioned to support corridor defense, fired continuously, breaking up German attacks before they could achieve penetration. Infantry held positions, gave ground when overwhelmed, counter-attacked immediately to restore lines. By afternoon, the German attacks had failed, but they demonstrated that holding the corridor would require continuous combat and steady casualties. Convoy operations through the corridor became studies in controlled chaos. Military police established traffic control points at both ends, organizing vehicles into groups, spacing convoys to minimize congestion. Each convoy moved under escort, tanks or tank destroyers at front and rear. Infantry and half-tracks positioned to respond if convoys were ambushed. Drivers received detailed instructions. Maintain speed. Maintain interval. If vehicle ahead is hit, keep moving unless physically blocked. If your vehicle is hit and you can drive, get off the road immediately to avoid blocking traffic. Combat engineers positioned at intervals along the corridor responded to blocked roads, using bulldozers to push disabled vehicles aside, working under fire because traffic delay increased vulnerability to artillery. The first ambulance convoys evacuating Bastogne's wounded made the return trip on December 27th. 600 seriously wounded men who'd been waiting in aid stations lying on stone floors in Belgian cellars, receiving minimal care because supplies had been exhausted. Now loaded into ambulances for the drive to rear hospitals, the convoy moved slowly, carefully. Ambulances marked with red crosses that German gunners sometimes respected and sometimes didn't. One ambulance took artillery hits that killed the driver and 3 wounded soldiers inside. Another hit a mine and overturned. But most got through, delivering wounded to hospitals where surgeons could provide care that forward aid stations couldn't. The evacuation continued over several days, clearing Bastogne's aid stations, making room for new casualties that would inevitably accumulate as fighting continued. Supply flow through the corridor during the first 48 hours. After relief totaled over 200 tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies. 20 tons are moving through a corridor under constant German observation, and periodic artillery fire represented logistical achievements that looked impossible. Until it happened. Quartermasters established distribution points just inside Bastogne's perimeter, where supply trucks from the corridor transferred loads to local vehicles for distribution to units. The system worked because everyone involved accepted risk as normal. Drivers understood they might die delivering supplies, but supplies had to be delivered, so they drove. Engineers understood they might die keeping the corridor open, but the corridor had to stay open, so they worked. Soldiers defending the corridor flanks understood they were targets for German counterattacks, but the flanks had to be held, so they fought. December 28 brought efforts to widen the corridor or to push German positions back far enough that artillery couldn't dominate the road. WW2 Armored Division attacked east and northeast, aiming to capture high ground that overlooked the corridor. The attacks made limited progress against German defenders who'd had time to prepare positions, and who fought with determination born from understanding that if they lost this terrain, Bastogne would be fully secured and their offensive would be definitively over. Every village, every ridge, every crossroad became a miniature battle. American forces advanced hundreds of yards per day rather than miles, taking casualties that accumulated into company-level losses, achieving tactical success measured in terrain secured rather than dramatic breakthrough. Engineers worked under combat conditions to improve the corridor road. They widened the traveled way from single lane to 2 lanes where terrain permitted. They filled shell craters. They reinforced sections that were breaking up under heavy traffic. They cleared mines from shoulders so disabled vehicles could pull off without hitting explosives. And they built bypasses around destroyed sections. They worked at night when German artillery observation was less effective, using minimal lighting, feeling their way through tasks that should have been done in daylight with proper equipment. Some were killed by artillery that found them despite darkness. Others were wounded by mines they were trying to clear. All understood that their work made the difference between corridor that functioned and corridor that became an unusable choke point. German artillery tactics evolved to maximize effect, rather than bombarding the corridor continuously, which exhausted their ammunition stocks. German gunners waited for convoys, and then concentrated fire on them. Observers watched the road, identified approaching vehicles, called fire missions time to bracket convoys. At the corridor's narrowest points, American counter-fire tried to suppress German artillery, but the Germans were skilled at shoot and move tactics, firing from one position and relocating before counter-battery fire arrived. The duel between German artillery trying to close the corridor and American forces trying to keep it open continued for weeks, long after newspapers had moved on to other stories, long after the relief of Bastogne had become historical fact rather than ongoing operation. By December 30th, the corridor had been widened to approximately 1,000 yards at its narrowest point. German artillery could still range it, but the wider corridor meant more room for convoys to maneuver, more positions for defending forces to occupy, more flexibility in routing traffic. The immediate crisis was over. Bastogne was no longer vulnerable to being cut off, but the human cost of establishing and maintaining that corridor was staggering. Over 300 American soldiers killed or wounded in the first week after relief, most of them killed keeping open a road that newspapers had declared secured. The soldiers who died in the corridor didn't die during dramatic breakthrough battles. They died doing maintenance work under artillery fire, driving supply trucks through German bombardment, holding defensive positions against counterattacks that never made headlines. Their deaths bought time and space for Baston's garrison to transform from besieged defenders to base for offensive operations. Whether that was worth the price depended on perspectives that varied between strategists calculating campaign effects and family members receiving telegrams that started, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret." December 30, 1944, 10 o'clock in the morning, General George Patton's jeep convoy entered Bastogne through the corridor. That was still under German artillery observation, and the timing was not coincidental. Patton had waited 3 days after initial relief before making his entrance, waited until the corridor was secure enough that his visit wouldn't disrupt operations, waited until press corps could be arranged to document the moment, when Third Army's commander personally congratulated the forces that had held, and the forces that had relieved. This was Patton at his most theatrical, understanding that war had psychological dimensions that required stage management, that symbols mattered, that his presence in Bastogne would mean something to soldiers, and something different to newspaper readers back home. He wore his famous pearl-handled revolvers and polished helmet. He stood in his jeep so everyone could see him. He was performing the role of victorious commander, and he was very good at it. The drive-through bomb revealed destruction that photographs couldn't fully capture. Buildings reduced to rubble, streets created by artillery, burned-out vehicles pushed to roadsides, and everywhere evidence of the fighting that had consumed the town for nearly 2 weeks. Shell holes, bullet scars, abandoned equipment, and the smell of cadites and death that lingered despite freezing temperatures. Patton toured the perimeter, stopping at positions where paratroopers stood in foxholes that had been their homes for days. The soldiers' reactions varied. Some stood straighter, responding to the presence of command authority. Others barely acknowledged him, too exhausted or too cynical to be impressed by generals visiting after the fighting was mostly over. Patton spoke briefly at each position, asking about conditions, praising their defense, telling them that Third Army had known they'd hold. Whether the soldiers believed his praise mattered less than the fact that he'd come, that command authority had acknowledged their sacrifice. The meeting between Patton and McAuliffe was orchestrated for maximum symbolic impact, but also reflected genuine respect between two officers who understood their roles. Patton arrived at McAuliffe headquarters, saluted, and delivered his prepared line. "You were doing quite well without me." McAuliffe, playing his part, but meaning it, responded, "We had to have help." The exchange, witnessed by staff, officers, and press correspondents, would be reported in newspapers across America. The relief commander acknowledging the defenders' courage, the defenders acknowledging the relief force's necessity. It was good public relations, but it was also accurate assessment. Bastogne had held because paratroopers refused to surrender. Bastogne was relieved because 4th Armored broke through. Both statements were true, and no amount of credit claiming by either side changed the mathematics of military operations. Patton insisted on touring aid stations where wounded were being treated. He walked through Belgian cellars, converted to surgical wards, spoke to soldiers awaiting evacuation, pinned medals on men who'd fought with particular valor. Medical personnel watched this performance with mixed feelings. Some appreciated that their commanding general was acknowledging wounded soldiers. Others resented the theater, felt that decorating men who'd lost limbs or would carry scars forever seemed inadequate compensation. Patton, if he sensed this resentment, didn't show it. He moved through the aid stations with practiced efficiency, saying the right words, creating the visual moments that press photographers would capture, understanding that sometimes leadership required being symbol rather than strategist. The medal ceremonies were pure Patton. He authorized immediate award of decorations for actions during the siege, cutting through normal bureaucratic delays, exercising command authority to recognize valor while it was still fresh. Silver stars and bronze stars were presented in brief ceremonies conducted amid ruins. Officers recommended for decorations received them from Patton's hands, with appropriate words about courage and duty and the honor of serving with such soldiers. The ceremonies served multiple purposes. They rewarded individual valor, they boosted morale among soldiers who witnessed them, and they created stories that would be reported back home, reinforcing narratives about American heroism and German defeat. Patton understood all these purposes and executed the ceremonies with the skill of someone who'd spent decades learning how to lead soldiers who fought better when they believed their sacrifices mattered. But there was also a private moment that fewer people witnessed. Patton stood alone as a three-star general surrounded by staff could be in the main square of Bastogne and looked at the destruction, the burned buildings and cratered streets and evidence of fighting that had killed hundreds and wounded thousands. His diary entry that evening would be characteristically brief. The town is a mess, but officers who were present reported that in that moment Patton's theatrical mask slipped, and what showed through was genuine recognition of cost. He'd promised to relieve Bastogne in 72 hours. He'd delivered in 7 days. The promise had been kept, but the price had been higher than planning estimates suggested. 15,000 Third Army casualties. A known number of German casualties. Belgian civilians dead or displaced. A town reduced to rubble. And for what? To prevent Germans from taking a crossroads that intelligence now suggested they couldn't have exploited even if captured. The strategic reality was emerging. Bastogne had been symbolically vital, but possibly not strategically decisive. Patton, standing in its ruins, might have been calculating whether the achievement justified the cost. The rivalry between airborne and armor was real and complicated. Paratroopers of the 101st believed correctly that they'd held bestowed through their own courage and skill, and they resented implications that they'd been rescued by armor. Tankers of 4th Armored believed also correctly that without their breakthrough, Bastogne's defenders would have eventually been overwhelmed, and they resented airborne units' attitude that relief had been unnecessary. The truth was more nuanced than either side wanted to acknowledge. Bastogne held because defenders fought brilliantly and relief succeeded, because 4th Armored executed brilliantly, and both achievements were necessary. Patton's public statements tried to honor both units, while claiming credit for 3rd Army overall. His speeches praised paratroopers' defense and armor's relief in equal measure, then pivoted to emphasizing that 3rd Army's overall performance had made both possible. It was credit claiming disguised as credit sharing, and it satisfied neither paratroopers nor tankers. While reinforcing Patton's own legend, press correspondents who'd accompanied Patton to Bastogne filed stories that emphasized drama over complexity. The stories featured Patton's arrival, his meetings with defenders, his medal ceremonies. They quoted his praise for American soldiers, and his prediction that 3rd Army would soon go on offensive. They mentioned casualties in passing, but emphasized victory. The stories created narrative momentum that shaped how Americans understood as triumph, rather than tragedy, as demonstration of American spirit rather than near disaster narrowly avoided. Patton understood this narrative and fed it deliberately, knowing that public morale mattered, that maintaining support for the war required emphasizing success rather than dwelling on cost. Whether this was cynical manipulation or responsible leadership depended on perspective that nobody could definitively resolve. By afternoon, Patton had completed his tour and returned to 3rd Army headquarters to plan next operations. The relief of Bastogne was complete. The corridor was open and being widened. German forces that had besieged the town were being pushed back, but the larger Battle of the Bulge continued across a 100-mile front, and 3rd Army's mission was expanding beyond relief to offensive operations, aimed at cutting off German forces that had penetrated Allied lines. Patton's visit to Bastogne had been necessary theater, important for morale and public relations, but it was also a brief interlude in larger campaign. He'd taken 3 hours to visit Bastogne, acknowledge its defenders, claim his share of credit for relief. Now he returned to the unglamorous work of commanding an army in winter combat, of calculating casualties against objectives, of making decisions that would determine whether tens of thousands of soldiers lived or died in coming weeks. The theatrical Patton, the one who visited Bastogne and handed out medals and gave quotable interviews, existed in service to the professional Patton, who understood that war was logistics and planning and ruthless calculation about acceptable losses. Both versions were real, both were necessary, and neither could exist without the other. January 2, 1945, Captain John Westover, 3rd Army Medical Officer, stood in a field hospital near Ardennes and performed a calculation that no amount of training prepared doctors to make comfortably. 1,463 American soldiers had passed through this hospital in the past 14 days. 782 had been treated and returned to duty. 416 had been evacuated to rear hospitals for extended care. 255 had died, despite everything medical personnel could do. The numbers were clinical, necessary for reports and planning. But behind each number was a name, a face. A soldier who'd been alive 2 weeks ago and who now was either recovering or permanently damaged, or dead. Westover had signed death certificates until his hand cramped. He'd written letters to families explaining that their sons or husbands had received every possible care. He'd supervised burial details that processed bodies with industrial efficiency, because individual treatment wasn't possible when deaths accumulated faster than graves could be dug in frozen ground. This was victory. This was what relief of Bastogne had cost. And this was just one hospital. The official 3rd Army casualty figures for December 19 through December 31st told the story in numbers that newspaper accounts mentioned briefly, then moved past 15,000 American casualties, 4,000 dead, 8,000 wounded, 3,000 missing, most of whom would later be confirmed as killed or captured. 4th Armored Division had taken over 1,000 casualties and lost more than half its tanks. 26th Infantry Division had taken 1,200 casualties with some rifle companies reduced to 50% strength. 80th Infantry Division had taken nearly 1,000 casualties, holding 3rd Army's flank. The 101st Airborne in Bastogne had taken 1,600 casualties during the siege. And beyond the combat units, there were the support casualties. Truck drivers killed by artillery, engineers blown up by mines, medical personnel hit by fire while treating wounded. The butcher's bill for relieving Bastogne exceeded what pre-operation estimates had suggested. Whether that made the operation a success or a costly near failure depended on calculations that mixed military effectiveness with moral weight of human life. The wounded told stories that statistics couldn't capture. Private James Murphy from Boston lost both legs to a mine while clearing roads in the corridor. He survived the amputation, survived the evacuation, would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, wondering if the road he'd been clearing was worth his legs. Corporal Thomas Chen from San Francisco took shrapnel through his chest during the attack on a scene in War, survived field surgery that should have killed him, would carry metal fragments near his heart for the next 60 years, and die at 83 from complications related to wounds received when he was 22. Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Chicago got frostbite so severe that 6 toes required amputation, ending his infantry career and leaving him with lifetime pain that no medical treatment fully addressed. These were the lucky ones. They survived. They went home. They lived with consequences, but they lived. The dead were harder to account for comprehensively. Graves registration teams recovered bodies from battlefields, processed personal effects, recorded identification, arranged burial or preparation for return to United States for eventual interment. The teams worked through January in below zero weather, searching positions where Americans had fought and died, finding bodies in foxholes and destroyed vehicles and snow-filled ravines. Some bodies couldn't be recovered immediately because they were in territory still under German control or because they were buried under snow and wouldn't be found until spring. Some bodies were so damaged by artillery or fire that identification was difficult or impossible. The teams did their work professionally, treating dead with respect. but also with efficiency necessary when processing hundreds of casualties. Each body became a report, a set of personal effects sent to next of kin, a grave marker in a military cemetery or a coffin shipped home. The dead had been soldiers, now they were statistics and memories. Non-combat casualties added layers of tragedy that weren't always acknowledged in official accounts. Over 2,000 American soldiers were casualties of weather, rather than German fire. Frostbite severe enough to require evacuation. Trench foot requiring hospitalization. Exposure cases where soldiers simply stopped functioning from cold. These casualties resulted from inadequate winter equipment, from command decisions that prioritize speed over proper preparation, from military culture that sometimes treated cold weather injuries as failures of soldier toughness, rather than failures of supply system. Soldiers who'd fought through France in summer and fall arrived in Ardennes in field jackets inadequate for below zero temperatures. They'd been told winter gear was coming. It came too late for thousands who suffered permanent damage from conditions that proper equipment might have prevented. German casualties were harder to estimate with precision, but intelligence assessments suggested Third Army operations December 19th through December 31st had killed or wounded over 15,000 German soldiers and captured another 15. 0 German units facing Third Army had been battered. The 5th Parachute Division reduced to 30% strength. Elements of Panzer Division destroyed. Dozens of smaller units effectively eliminated as combat formations. The Germans had failed to take bone, failed to stop Third Army's relief operation and paid heavily for that failure. But German casualties, while militarily significant, didn't carry the same emotional weight for American commanders as American casualties. The strategic calculation was simpler. German losses weakened enemy capability. American losses required replacement, created political pressure, generated questions about whether operations were being conducted efficiently. Belgian civilian casualties added moral complexity that military reports mentioned briefly, then moved past. Approximately 750 Belgian civilians were killed in Bastogne and surrounding areas during the siege and relief operation. They died from German artillery fired at American positions, from American artillery fired at German positions, from bombs dropped by American aircraft, from crossfire during street fighting, from starvation and cold in cellars where they sheltered. Most had been given no choice about whether to stay or evacuate. They'd been trapped by circumstances, made victims by geography, killed by military operations they had no control over. American forces tried to minimize civilian casualties, but trying wasn't always succeeding, and the civilians who died were just as dead, regardless of which side fired the shells that killed them. The long-term cost exceeded what casualty reports captured in January 1945. Soldiers who survived physically carried psychological scars that wouldn't be caused for decades, but which were just as real. Men who'd seen friends killed developed survival guilt that haunted them forever. Men who'd killed in close combat developed trauma that expressed itself in nightmares and depression, and difficulty readjusting to civilian life. Men who'd been surrounded in Bastogne or who'd fought through the corridor experienced hypervigilance and anxiety that never fully resolved. The medical system of 1945 didn't have good treatment for psychological trauma. Soldiers were expected to function, to suppress trauma, to demonstrate the toughness that military culture valued. Some managed, others didn't. Alcoholism, failed marriages, suicide decades after the war. These were casualties of Bastogne that never appeared in military statistics, but which were just as real as battlefield deaths. January 2nd, Captain Westover finished his report and filed it with higher headquarters, knowing it would be aggregated with other reports, compiled into larger statistics, eventually published in after-action analyses that historians would study. The numbers would be analyzed, debated, compared to other operations. Scholars would calculate casualty exchange ratios, and determine whether Third Army had achieved acceptable results. But Westover, who treated the wounded and documented the dead, knew something the statistics couldn't capture: that each casualty represented someone's complete world ending or changing forever. The soldier who died on his operating table had been someone's son, possibly someone's husband, definitely someone who'd had plans for after the war that would never happen. The soldier who lost his legs had been hauled to weeks ago, and would spend the rest of his life adjusting to new reality. The statistical analysis was necessary for military planning, but it also created dangerous distance from human cost. 15,000 casualties, 4,000 dead. Numbers that could be written in reports without fully confronting what they meant. Westover signed his report and walked outside into January cold that was still killing soldiers through exposure and frostbite. The relief of Bastogne was military success. Whether it was worth what it cost wasn't a question medical officers were trained to answer. But standing in the cold outside a hospital full of wounded soldiers, looking at graves, registration teams still processing dead, Westover couldn't help calculating costs that statistics didn't capture, and wondering if anyone in command was doing the same calculation. December 25, 1944. While American soldiers fought to relieve Bastogne, German Führer Adolf Hitler met with his senior commanders at the Adlerist headquarters in Western Germany and confronted a reality his strategic planning had refused to acknowledge. Operation Vactamine had failed. Not failed completely. German forces still held the Bulge, a still occupied territory they'd seized in the offensive first days, but failed in its strategic objectives so completely that operational success was irrelevant. The plan had required reaching the Meuse River by December 22nd, crossing by December 24th, capturing Antwerp by December 28th. It was now December 25th. German spearheads were 40 miles short of the Meuse. They weren't moving forward. They were being pushed back, and critical to understanding the failure was recognizing that Bastogne, which had consumed so much German effort, and which newspapers were calling the key to the battle, was actually a sideshow to larger strategic collapse that had become inevitable. Before Patton ever reached the town, the German offensive had been predicated on several assumptions, all of which proved incorrect. First, that surprise would allow rapid advance before American forces could respond. This had succeeded initially but collapsed by December 19th when Eisenhower redirected forces faster than German planning anticipated. Second, that weather would ground Allied air power long enough for German forces to reach objectives. This had worked for 8 days but ended December 23rd, after which German forces were devastated by air attacks they couldn't counter. Third, that captured American fuel depots would supplement German supplies. This had failed completely. American forces denied Germans access to fuel stocks, and German advance units literally ran out of gas within sight of fuel they couldn't reach. Fourth, that American forces would panic and retreat as French forces had in 1940. This had never happened. Even units that were surrounded or defeated fought long enough to delay German advance and create time for reinforcement. The fuel crisis was particularly catastrophic and rarely emphasized in accounts. Focused on Bastogne's relief, German forces began the offensive with enough fuel for approximately 50 miles of advance. Reaching the Meuse required 90 miles. Reaching Antwerp required 120 miles. The plan depended on capturing American fuel stocks, and when that failed, the offensive became mathematically impossible to sustain. By December 23rd, German tank units were abandoning vehicles that had run out of fuel. Panthers and Tigers, the heavy tanks that American forces feared in combat, sat immobilized on Belgian roads, not from battle damage, but from empty fuel tanks. German infantry walked past abandoned armor, knowing that their offensive had lost its mobile component, that they were now fighting on foot against an enemy with unlimited fuel and air superiority. The offensive continued through momentum and hope, but the outcome was already determined by logistics that strategic planning had underestimated. The northern shoulder of the German penetration near Elsenborn Ridge had held throughout the offensive. American forces under First Army commands stopped German attacks despite heavy pressure, denying Germans the road network they needed to support advance toward the Meuse, the southern shoulder, defended by units that later came under Patton's command, similarly held. This meant that the entire German salient was compressed into a narrow penetration that created vulnerable flanks and required more resources to hold than to exploit. German commanders recognized this by December 23, before Bastogne was relieved, and recommended withdrawing to defensible positions. Before American counterattacks trapped German forces in an indefensible salient, Hitler refused, ordering continued offense despite tactical impossibility. The order trapped German forces in exactly the situation their commanders had warned about. Intelligence assessments declassified decades after the war revealed that Allied codebreakers had intercepted German communications throughout the offensive. Ultra-intercepts showed German fuel shortages, morale problems, and command disputes in real time. Allied commanders knew by December 23 that German offensive capability was exhausted, that the threat to Antwerp was gone, that the Germans couldn't exploit even if they captured Bastogne. This intelligence informed Eisenhower's strategic decisions, but wasn't shared with tactical commanders who continued fighting with belief that German breakthrough remained possible. The intelligence gap created disconnect. Strategic commanders knew the outcome while tactical commanders and soldiers fought believing the battle's result remained uncertain. Whether this information should have been shared, whether knowing that strategic victory was already achieved would have changed tactical operations remained debated for decades. The alternative history question that historians argued over was whether Bastogne actually mattered strategically. One school argued that holding Bastogne denied Germans road network necessary for exploitation, that losing Bastogne would have allowed German advance to continue, that therefore the defense was strategically vital. Another school argued that German fuel shortages made exploitation impossible, regardless of road network, that Bastogne's defense was tactically impressive but strategically irrelevant, that Germans couldn't have exploited the town even if captured. Both interpretations were supported by evidence. Both contained truth. The disconnect suggested that Bastogne mattered symbolically and tactically more than strategically, that its defense and relief demonstrated American capability and determination, but didn't fundamentally change the battle's strategic outcome that was already determined by December 23. The German plan had one final assumption that proved catastrophically wrong, that American forces would take weeks to mount coordinated counterattacks. Instead, Patton's Third Army pivoted in 72 hours. Montgomery's forces attacked from the north within a week. American reinforcements arrived from England faster than German intelligence thought possible. The coordination between Allied forces, though complicated by personality conflicts and national rivalries, functioned effectively enough to trap German forces in the Bulge and systematically reduce the salient. German commanders who'd planned on American disorganization found instead a military machine that recovered from surprise faster than they could exploit it. The contrast between German expectations and American performance was starker than any other factor in explaining offensive failure. By early January 1945, the strategic situation was clear. Even to German commanders who'd supported the offensive, German forces had suffered 70,000 casualties, had lost most of their remaining armor, had consumed fuel reserves that couldn't be replaced, had accomplished none of their strategic objectives, and were now trapped in a salient that would take weeks to evacuate. While under constant Allied pressure, the offensive that Hitler had called Germany's last chance to change the war's outcome had instead accelerated German defeat by consuming resources that might have prolonged the war. If used defensively, the Ardennes offensive failed not because Bastogne held or because Patton relieved it, though both were tactically significant, but because the strategic planning was flawed, the logistical foundation was inadequate, and American military capability was underestimated by planners who remembered 1940 and didn't account for 4 years of American learning, adaptation, and improvement. The strategic reality suggested uncomfortable questions about whether Baston's relief, while Snord's tactically brilliant and symbolically powerful, was strategically necessary. If German offensive was already failing by December 23, if fuel shortages and Allied air power had made further German advance impossible, then did relieving Bastogne change the battle's outcome or merely accelerate what was already inevitable? Military historians debated this for decades without reaching consensus. Some argued that Baston's defense and relief prevented worst-case scenarios, even if basis scenarios made relief unnecessary. Others argued that resources devoted to relieving Bastogne could have been used elsewhere more effectively. Both positions acknowledged that Patton's relief operation was tactically impressive, but disagreed about strategic necessity. The debate itself suggested that military operations could be simultaneously successful and questionable, that achieving objectives didn't automatically justify costs, that strategic analysis required considering not just what happened, but what else might have happened with different decisions. January 1945 brought recognition throughout Allied command that the Battle of the Bulge, while costly, had actually weakened Germany more than it had hurt Allied forces. German losses in men and material couldn't be replaced. American losses, while painful, were absorbed by replacement system and industrial production. The offensive had delayed Allied operations by approximately 6 weeks, but hadn't changed the war's fundamental trajectory. Germany would still lose. The question was timeline, and that timeline had likely been shortened by the Ardennes offensive that consumed Germany's last mobile reserves. Whether that strategic outcome justified the tactical decisions made during the battle, whether Bastogne specifically was worth its cost, remained questions that commanders and historians would debate without final resolution. The strategic reality was complicated, mixed, resistant to simple narratives of triumph or tragedy. It was like most of war, messy and morally ambiguous and dependent on perspectives that different people would weight differently forever. December 27, 1944. In a military briefing room in Versailles, public relations officers drafted press releases that would shape how millions of Americans understood the Battle of the Bulge and the relief of Bastogne. The releases emphasized American heroism, German defeat, Allied unity, and successful cooperation between air, ground, and armor forces. They mentioned casualties, but minimized them. They praised specific units while crediting overall Allied command. They quoted generals saying inspiring things about American determination and military superiority. And critically, they constructed a narrative that transformed tactical complexity into simple story. Americans were surprised. Germans advanced. Defenders held heroically. Relief forces broke through brilliantly. Enemy was defeated. The narrative was accurate in broad strokes, but omitted or simplified details that would have complicated the story. It was in short exactly what public relations officers were supposed to produce. Truth shaped for maximum mal effect and minimum political complication. Patton understood myth-making better than most commanders, and participated actively in constructing his own legend. His diary entries from late December were written with awareness that they'd eventually be published. His letters to his wife emphasized his role in planning and executing the relief operation. His conversations with press correspondents provided quotable lines that appeared in newspapers within days. The relief of Bastogne was the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed. True, arguably, but also self-promotion disguised as factual assessment. Patton recommended his subordinates 4 medals, knowing the medal citations would emphasize Third Army's achievements. He held press conferences where he explained the relief operation in terms that emphasized speed, skill, and American military superiority. He was building legend in real time, and he had decades of practice doing exactly that. The Nut story entered American popular culture within a week of the relief. Newspapers reported McAuliffe's one-word response to German surrender demand. Editorial cartoons depicted American defiance. Politicians quoted it in speeches. It became shorthand for American determination and refusal to quit. What newspapers didn't report was the calculated nature of McCliff's response, the staff discussion about how to phrase the reply, the deliberate choice of informal language that would resonate with American public. While insulting Germans, the story was true. McAuliffe did say nuts. The response was delivered to Germans, but it was also performed, crafted for effect, designed to become exactly the kind of propaganda moment that it became. Both truths coexisted: genuine battlefield communication and carefully constructed public relations gesture. Hollywood began planning the Stone films before the battle even ended. Studio executives recognized that the siege and relief provided perfect dramatic structure. Heroes surrounded, supplies running low, relief force racing to arrive before it's too late. Climactic breakthrough. Scripts were drafted emphasizing individual heroism over systemic factors. Characters were created who represented American values. Dialogue was written that turned tactical communications into memorable lines. The resulting film, Battleground, released in 1949, became one of the most successful war films of its era and cemented popular understanding of Bastogne that emphasized heroism, hardship, and triumph. The film was reasonably accurate about tactical details, but created narrative structure that simplified complexity into accessible story. Millions of Americans learned about Bastogne from this film, which meant they learned the mythologized version rather than the complicated historical version. Military history, as written in official after-action reports, also participated in myth-making, though more subtly. Reports emphasize successful operations while downplaying failures or complicating factors. Third Army after-action reports stress the speed of the relief operation and the tactical brilliance of the attack while mentioning logistics problems only briefly. First Army reports emphasized the defense of Elsinburn Ridge and other northern positions, while mentioning breakthrough areas less prominently. The reports were factual. They didn't fabricate evidence, but they shaped narrative through emphasis and omission. Successful operations received detailed coverage. Operations that failed or struggled received brief mention. The accumulated effect was documentation that supported narrative of American military competence, while underplaying the chaos, confusion, and near disasters that characterized actual operations. Competing narratives emerged that complicated the simple story. British commanders emphasized Montgomery's role in stopping the northern shoulder of the German penetration, arguing that British forces contributed as much or more than American forces to defeating the offensive. Airborne units emphasized their defense of Bastogne and resented implications they needed rescue. Infantry divisions resented armor receiving credit for breakthrough, while infantry did the unsexy work of holding flanks and clearing supply routes. Each unit, each service branch, each national component of Allied forces had perspective that emphasized their contributions, while minimizing others. The myth-making was collective and competitive, with different groups constructing narratives that served their interests while claiming to be simply reporting facts. The Cold War context that followed. World War I shaped Bastogne mythology in specific ways. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, as tensions with Soviet Union increased, American military sought examples demonstrating American capability and determination. Bastogne fit perfectly. Americans surprised by enemy attack responding effectively, defeating enemy offensive, demonstrating that free societies produced better soldiers than authoritarian regimes. The story was used in recruitment, in training, in public speeches, justifying military budgets. Politicians referenced Bastogne when arguing for strong military. Military leaders cited it as example of American fighting spirit. The story became tool for Cold War messaging, which meant it was simplified and emphasized in ways that served present political needs rather than historical accuracy. Academic historians began challenging the simplified narrative. By 1970s, scholars with access to German records and ultra-intelligence demonstrated that strategic situation was more complicated than popular accounts suggested. Military historians showed that Patton's relief, while tactically brilliant, wasn't quite the miracle that press accounts claimed. It was planned operation executed by professional army rather than impossible feat, achieved through individual genius. Historians demonstrated that Bastogne's strategic importance was debatable, that the defense was impressive but possibly not decisive. These scholarly challenges didn't displace popular mythology. Most Americans continued understanding Bastogne through films and popular histories, rather than academic monographs, but they created alternative narrative that acknowledged complexity. The tension between necessary myth and complex truth remained unresolved and probably unresolvable. Societies needed inspiring stories, needed examples of heroism and determination, needed narratives that made sacrifice meaningful. Soldiers who fought at Bastogne deserved recognition and honor. Commanders who executed difficult operations deserved credit for success. But myth-making also obscured failures, simplified complexity, created narratives that served political purposes rather than historical truth. Both needs for inspiring mythology and for accurate history were legitimate. Both served purposes. The problem was that they were often incompatible, that the same story couldn't simultaneously inspire and complicate, that choosing between them required accepting that either morale or truth would be sacrificed. Bastogne became whatever people needed it to be. Symbol of American heroism, example of military professionalism, demonstration of determination, illustration of wars, horror, argument for strong military, warning about costs of conflict. All of these were true from different perspectives. None captured the complete truth, and the complete truth, messy, complicated, resistant to simple interpretation, remained available to anyone willing to look beyond mythology and engage with historical complexity that rewarded effort with understanding, but denied the comfort of simple stories. December 1994, 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. Elderly men in their 70s and 80s returned to Bastogne for commemorative ceremonies, many making what they knew would be their final visit to the place where they'd fought 5 decades earlier. They walked streets that had been rebuilt, stood at memorials that hadn't existed in 1944, met Belgian civilians who maintained American cemeteries with care that demonstrated gratitude transcending generations. Some veterans wept, others remained stoic. All were processing memories that time had softened but not erased. A veteran of the 101st Airborne stood in a foxhole that had been preserved as memorial, and tried to explain to his grandson what it had felt like to defend this position. Hungry and cold and afraid, believing relief might never come. The grandson listened, but couldn't fully understand, could only acknowledge that something important had happened here, something that mattered enough that his grandfather had returned after 50 years to remember. The veteran interviews conducted during anniversary commemorations revealed complexity that press coverage in 1944 had omitted. Veterans spoke about fear and cold and watching friends die. They spoke about making it through each day without thinking about tomorrow, because tomorrow might not happen. They spoke about bonds formed with soldiers they'd lived and fought beside, bonds that civilian friendships never quite matched. But they also spoke about costs, physical injuries that never fully healed, psychological scars that therapy helped but didn't eliminate, survivor guilt about coming home when others didn't. The interviews captured what mythology missed, that military achievement and personal trauma coexisted, that being part of something historically significant didn't compensate for what had been lost, that heroism and horror were inseparable parts of the same experience. Modern military forces studied Bastogne as case study in flexibility, rapid response and combined arms warfare. The operation appeared in curriculum at staff colleges and war colleges. Officers analyzed Patton's planning, 4th Armored tactics, the logistics that made the relief possible. They identified lessons that remained relevant: importance of contingency planning, value of decentralized command, criticality of logistics, effectiveness of mass artillery fires, power of air-ground coordination. But they also identified lessons about what didn't transfer: specific tactics obsolete in era of precision weapons, command methods incompatible with modern communication technology, operational approaches that depended on circumstances unique to World War II. The historical study served present purpose, teaching modern officers while acknowledging that past wasn't template for future. The debate about Patton's legacy intensified rather than resolved over decades. Some military professionals viewed him as model commander, aggressive, innovative, capable of achieving results others thought impossible. Others viewed him as cautionary tale, ego-driven, reckless with subordinates' lives, more concerned with personal glory than operational efficiency. Both interpretations drew support from Bastogne. Supporters emphasized the successful relief. Critics noted the casualties and questioned strategic necessity. The debate reflected broader tensions in military culture about what constituted effective leadership, whether results justified methods, how to balance mission accomplishment against soldier welfare. These tensions remained unresolved because they weren't resolvable. They were fundamental questions about military ethics that each generation and each leader had to answer personally. Belgium's relationship with Bastogne reflected complicated gratitude toward liberators, who'd both saved and destroyed. The town had been freed from German occupation, but also reduced to rubble in the process. Belgian civilians had been killed by artillery from both sides. Families had lost homes and property, and yet anniversary commemorations emphasized gratitude rather than recrimination. Belgian citizens maintained American military cemeteries, educated children about American sacrifice, held annual ceremonies honoring liberators. The relationship suggested that liberation's value outweighed destruction's cost, that being freed from Nazi occupation justified the suffering liberation had caused. Whether individual Belgian families, who'd lost members to American artillery, agreed with this collective judgment, wasn't documented as prominently as official gratitude. The contemporary relevance of Bastogne's military case study diminished as warfare evolved. Modern American military operations emphasized precision strikes, minimal casualties, rapid victory with limited commitment of forces. The kind of attritional warfare represented by Bastogne, thousands of casualties, accepted as necessary cost of achieving objectives, became politically unacceptable. In democratic societies with all-volunteer militaries, military planners still studied Bastogne for tactical and operational lessons, but strategic lessons were increasingly questionable in era where public tolerance for casualties had dropped dramatically. The question that haunted modern military thought was whether democracies could still fight wars that required Bastogne-level sacrifice, whether public would accept costs that World War II generation had considered necessary, whether future conflicts requiring sustained casualties were politically feasible. The individual stories that didn't fit clean narratives accumulated through decades of historical research. Stories about soldiers who broke under stress, about commanders who made terrible mistakes, about friendly fire incidents and supply failures and operations that succeeded despite, rather than because of planning. These stories complicated the heroic narrative without displacing it, added texture without changing fundamental judgments that bestowed defense and relief, demonstrated American military capability. History wasn't mythology rejected, but mythology complicated. Simple stories replaced with complex understanding that honored achievement while acknowledging cost and imperfection. December 2024 would mark 80 years since the battle. The youngest World War II veterans were approaching 100 years old. Soon there would be no living connection to the events. No one who could speak from personal experience about what Bastogne felt like or meant. The history would transition from lived memory to documented history, from personal testimony to academic study. This transition happened to every historical eventually, but it marked threshold where mythology became harder to challenge, because no veterans remained to complicate simplified stories. The question for historians and military professionals was how to preserve complexity, while acknowledging that popular understanding would inevitably simplify. How to honor veterans while maintaining historical accuracy. How to teach lessons while admitting that lessons were debatable and contested. The final assessment of Bastogne depended on what questions were being asked. Was the relief operation tactically brilliant? Yes, clearly. Was it strategically decisive? Debatable. Probably not. Was Patton a genius commander? In some ways, yes. In other ways, problematic. Did American forces demonstrate impressive capability? Absolutely. Did the operation cost more than it should have? Possibly, though counterfactuals were improvable. Was the achievement worth the casualties? Depends who was answering and from what perspective. The ambiguity wasn't failure of historical analysis, but accurate reflection of complex reality that resisted simple judgment. Bastogne was simultaneously triumph and tragedy, demonstration of capability and illustration of cost, source of national pride and reminder of war's horror. All of these were true. None was complete truth, and the echo of Bastogne would continue resonating through military history and American memory precisely because it couldn't be reduced to simple story, because it demanded engagement with complexity, because it honored both achievement and sacrifice without allowing either to erase the other. The visitors to Bastogne today, walking through the Marty Memorial, reading names of American soldiers killed in the Ardennes, are engaging with history that matters differently than it mattered in 1944. They're not defending freedom or relieving besieged garrison. They're remembering, honoring, trying to understand. The memorial's architecture encourages this circular design representing eternity. Names arranged by states representing diverse national sacrifice. Crypt with religious symbols representing different faiths united in common cause. Its memorial designed to honor without glorifying, to remember without simplifying. The greatest respect we can offer soldiers who fought at Bastogne isn't to mythologize their achievement, but to understand what they actually did, why it mattered, what it cost, and how imperfectly but genuinely they accomplished something that remains worth remembering 80 years later, and will remain worth remembering as long as societies value courage, sacrifice, and the complicated truth about what military operations actually require and actually achieve.